Three colors only were in evidence: the white of the snow, the gray of the sky, the black of the souls and the hearts. No trees or plant life of any kind broke through the crust of the moonscape. No birds ever appeared in the sky. In fact, the only life of any kind that had ever been seen here was the gray shadows that passed for humanity. The only sounds? The wind, the muffled sob, the anguished scream, the snap of a breaking arm or a frozen power line. This icy piece of forgotten ground had a name, a dot on some maps, and little else. Its 4 run-down buildings, the only ones for over 100 miles in any direction, were just waiting for the right wind to blow them away into the oblivion they deserved. But somehow Piatigorsk remained, a monument to the lunacy of its creators. The helicopter thudded to a stop on the frozen ground. A crewman slid the door open, and Major Valery Vitenka jumped out. The rotor blades kicked up an insane blizzard. Vitenka, pelted by ice, took careful steps forward, desperately trying to pierce the flying whiteness and debris. The storm abated as the helicopter took off. A man stood in front of Vitenka, his face obscured by a heavy furred parka hood. He gestured ahead, and they walked into the nearest building. Slowly they peeled off their parkas and hung them on a nearby rack. The man, a line sergeant well over 50, looked Vitenka over slowly. "I am Major Vitenka," he began. "I carry priority—" "Whatever. This way." The sergeant led Vitenka down a dimly lit corridor to a door marked Director, Custodial Affairs. The sergeant knocked loudly twice, then opened the door. An assault of bright light cascaded from the room. Squinting, Vitenka walked through. "Major Vitenka?" said a short, hard man with an incongruously warm smile. He stood behind his desk. "Welcome to Detention Barracks number 6210. Vitenka snapped to attention. "Major Valery Vitenka, sir. I carry priority papers from Internal Security, Moscow Central." The man casually returned the salute. "Colonel Igor Ruinov, at your service, Major. Please." He gestured for Vitenka to sit. "You are hail and gone from Moscow Central, Major. What can I do for you?" "Sir, I bring you the personal compliments of Lieutenant General Medvedov. He wishes me to express to you his deep satisfaction and gratitude for your work at this facility." Ruinov shrugged. "A long way to come for that, Major." He studied the man across from him. His insignia showed him to be a military academy graduate, his ribbons predominantly for conduct and efficiency, none for combat. His hair and his uniform were service manual perfect. In short, pampered, educated, inexperienced. "Major, have you ever been to a 62 series detention barracks before?" "No, sir, but I am directly responsible for overseeing their weekly productivity reports and thereby have an intimate knowledge of them." Ruinov sighed. "Sir, here are the priority papers." Vitenka handed them across the desk. Ruinov broke the seal and began to read. He stopped midway through the 3rd page. "What are these Neftegorsk Accords?" "Sir, they were signed by President Yeltsin and the American President Clinton, I believe, in late 1995. I don't recall hearing anything about it. Of course, up here news travels very slowly." He returned to his reading. "What is the meat of the thing?" "In exchange for American loan guarantees for the purchase of American durable goods, the Russian Republic promises to repatriate all American citizens being held in Republic prisons. There are 3 phases: status offenders, then non-political statute offenders." "Good riddance." Suddenly, Ruinov froze. "Special?" "It was felt," Vitenka said flatly, ignoring his tone, "that it would be appropriate to include special political prisoners in the 3rd phase. They cost the most to maintain and serve little purpose in this new world order." "And in this new world order of yours, espionage is not to be punished?" "On the contrary," Vitenka said easily. "It has been determined that espionage will be punished by a term of imprisonment not to exceed 5 years. We will turn over only those individuals whom we have held for longer." Ruanoff returned to his reading. I don't know how many of those we... He stopped as he turned to the last page. My God! Ruanoff was turning white, his breath labored. You cannot be serious. There has been an error. This man, 90, 1368, you actually intend to release him? He falls within the terms of the Accords. Ruanoff pounded his fist on the desk. Major, I will not take the responsibility for unleashing that... I will not accept that responsibility. My apologies, sir, Vatenka began slowly. But your orders are explicitly clear. I am going to damn well confirm them with General Medvedov. Only then will I carry them out, and only after my strongest objections have been certified for the record. Do you understand me, Major? Vatenka didn't, but the colonel had the rank, and there was no going anywhere until tomorrow afternoon anyway. Sir! Yes, sir! He snapped to attention. Colonel, sir, while you confirm the orders, might I see the prisoner? Ruanoff took a deep breath and pressed a button on his desk. A moment later, the line sergeant returned. Yeah? Nevronsky, see that the major is escorted to Barracks 3. Nevronsky shrugged. Sir. Vatenka followed Nevronsky down the dim corridor. By the way, the sergeant asked, which prisoner am I taking you to? 90-1368 Sigma. Nevronsky suddenly stopped, staring at Vatenka as if he'd lost his mind. I've got to be kidding. Vatenka had reached the end of his patience. You will come to attention, line sergeant. He stopped as he heard the cocking of a semi-automatic. He looked down to see the barrel pointing at his groin. Major, you aren't in Moscow now. Here on the dark side of the moon, we have our own way of doing things, and the smart man learns how to adapt to it. Vatenka had heard of cases of claustrophobic insanity in the 62 barracks before. The cold, the isolation, the pressure of dealing with the Republic's most dangerous criminals. What do you want, line sergeant? He said softly. Major, I've been ordered to take you to Barracks 3. I'll do that, but if you want me to take you to 1368, you'd better give me a reason with more teeth than orders. I have orders to deliver 1368 to the Americans. A smile slowly spread across Nevronsky's face. And the sense, he muttered under his breath. He uncocked the gun and clapped Vatenka on the back. Major, you are about to make some men very happy. He started down the corridor, followed by a very confused Vatenka. Nevronsky threw open a door at the end. 3 men looked up at him from their card game. Sasha, Mikhail, Janos, come with me and bring your weapons. We're going to pay a call on 1368. Vatenka saw the men's faces turn from disinterest to fear. Nevronsky shrugged. It might be to say goodbye to the bastard. Reluctantly, they stood up, pulled on their jackets, grabbed their Kalashnikovs, and trooped into the corridor. Vatenka followed them down a flight of stairs and into a bone-chilling tunnel reinforced with wooden planks. Sergeant, Vatenka said quietly, what in hell is going on here? The colonel acts as if it is treason to release this man, and you act as if this is second Christmas. What did they tell you about him? Nevronsky asked. He's an American intelligence agent who was captured by internal security forces 6.5 years ago. He received a life sentence and was sent here. Typical, Nevronsky said. Major, 1368 is not an intelligence agent. He looked into Vatenka's eyes. He is the devil. They stepped out of the tunnel and started up another flight of stairs. When he was first brought here, Nevronsky continued, he was under heavy sedation. Our orders were simple. He was to be held under maximum security. We could restrain him, punish him, but under no circumstances could we kill him. When he first regained consciousness, he killed the nurse corporal who was attending him. He also seriously injured 3 guards before he was restrained. He pointed to his left. Steel doors lined both sides of a well-lit corridor. Since that time, Nabronsky continued, he has killed 2 more guards, crippled 2 others, and escaped twice. Escaped? Nabronsky nodded. The first time we found him passed out on the ice after 4 days and nights of sub-zero freeze. Don't ask me how he survived. I don't ask the devil how he does his tricks. The second time, somehow, he crossed the snowplain and made it to the settlement of Kursk. Nabronsky seemed to be reliving a painful memory. He caused the deaths of a family of 4 and 2 militiamen before we finally caught him. Petenka looked shocked. He was never tried for the murders? 1368 is classified Sigma Theta Alpha, politically sensitive. If the colonel had his way, he would have driven a stake through the man's heart years ago. But Moscow's orders, we couldn't touch him. Just restrain him as best we could and hope he died of natural causes. They stopped 10 feet away from the door at the end of the corridor. The men fanned out, pointing their rifles at it. Nabronsky pounded on the door. Prisoner 90, 1368. You will rise, move to the far wall, and kneel against it. You will cross your legs at the ankles with your hands on your head in plain view. If you are not in this position when the door is opened, you will be fired on. The door is opening in 10 seconds. Beads of sweat stood out at the old sergeant's temples as he slowly drew back the bolt and pulled open the heavy door. He immediately jumped back, gun pointed through the door. Seeing the barest nod from Nabronsky, Petenka slowly stepped toward the door. The man was in the demanded position, on his knees, hands on head, ankles crossed. Petenka stepped forward, feeling the fear behind him, fingers twitching on the triggers. Prisoner 90-1368. I am Major Vitenka of the Russian Republic's Internal Security Apparatus, he said in letter-perfect but accented English. Arrangements have been made for your release and return to America. He paused, waiting for a response that never came. To accomplish this, I must speak with you and obtain confirmation of your identity. Come on in, the man said. The voice was chillingly flat. Major, Nabronsky whispered urgently, if you step inside, I cannot guarantee your safety. Petenka looked from Nabronsky to the prisoner. Prisoner 90-1368? His throat felt dry. I assure you that this is no trick. I mean you no ill will. Then you have nothing to fear in coming in. Petenka bit his lip, then walked into the cell. Keep out of the doorway, Major, Nabronsky called from the corridor. The cell was 6 by 7 feet, barely enough room for the cot that lined one wall. A covered bucket stood in the corner. The walls were decaying cement, crisscrossed with steel bars, a cage within a tomb. Petenka kept his gaze fixed on the man on the floor. What is your name, prisoner 90-1368? 90-1368, was the atonal reply. If you do not cooperate, your release will be jeopardized. I'm not big on cooperation, the man said calmly. But I might be more communicative if I was allowed to stand. I think better on my feet. Petenka steeled himself for the worst. Very well. Major! Line Sergeant! You will not fire as long as the prisoner obeys orders. Petenka turned back to the prisoner. Your movements will remain slow and deliberate at all times. Do you understand? My movements are always deliberate, Major. He slowly stood up to face Petenka. He was just under 6 feet tall, thin, under 160 pounds. His thick brown hair was streaked with gray. His face was drawn, his skin pale, but his eyes burned with an inner fire that shook Petenka to his core. They seemed to see everything. Hoping his nervousness didn't show too much, Vatenka smiled. The Russian Republic has seen fit to exercise its mercy upon you. You are to be released. The man stared, unblinking, at Vatenka. I'm touched. You merely need to answer a few questions. Vatenka pulled his memo book from his pocket. What is your name, sir? Brian Newman. Date and place of birth? July 23rd, 1956, Los Angeles, California. Your mother's maiden name? Green Heights. Vatenka looked down the column of identifying information. He had no desire to prolong this and pocketed his memo book. I am satisfied? Newman turned to look out at the nervous guards. They've developed quite a legend around me, you know. He kept his eyes locked on the guards while he talked to Vatenka. They tell you the one about my daring escape to Kursk? They said that you killed a family and some militiamen. Newman turned to him, a surprised expression on his face. Really? He slowly shook his head. It gets better every time. Do tell me, what's my total body count up to now? I think 9 people? 9? That's amazing. Newman walked over to the bed. If we're traveling tomorrow, I should get my rest. It will be tomorrow, won't it? Barring the unforeseen? Yes. Vatenka turned and stepped out of the cell. Nebronsky quickly stepped forward to close the door. Line Sergeant Nebronsky? Nebronsky stopped as the cold voice floated out to him. You shouldn't tell stories out of school. Don't you know what happens to bad little boys who make things up? Shaking, Nebronsky slammed the door shut and quickly threw the bolt. So, Major, the colonel began without preliminaries, you still intend to release 1368? Yes. It seems that General Medvedov agrees with you. I just got off the radio with him. The man looked as if he were in pain. He refuses to see. There was nothing I could do but lodge my objections. Colonel, if you consider this man such a threat, why object to his leaving? Why not just let the Americans deal with him? For over 6 years I have watched 1368. He is a cold, calculating killer. Here we have him under at least some control. To let him loose on an unsuspecting public is something I cannot willingly do. He quickly signed some papers on his desk and handed them to Vatenka. Fortunately, it is not up to us to make this decision. The following afternoon, Vatenka waited by the helipad. Ruinov joined him. They just called. They're bringing him down now. Good, Vatenka nodded. The helicopter is due any minute. The sound of metal on metal caused them to look behind them. Newman, surrounded by guards, stood in the doorway to the main building. A thick leather belt ran around the waist of his parka. Connected to it were 5 chains. 1 each ran to shackles around his ankles and wrists, the 5th to a heavy leather collar around his neck, forcing him to walk bent over. In addition, handcuffs held his wrists and legs close together. The helicopter flashed overhead, and minutes later was idling its engines on the ground. 3 armed soldiers climbed down and helped Vatenka and the guards load Newman into the back of the chopper. After checking that Newman was secured, Vatenka returned to the colonel. Ruinov was yelling into the ear of a junior officer who had just come running up. He turned when Vatenka approached. Ruinov was white-faced. Nebronsky is dead. What? They just found his body at the foot of a flight of stairs. Vatenka's head was spinning. He slipped. The stairs were icy. I myself almost... Ruinov was ignoring him, staring instead at Newman in the helicopter. Newman, half leaning out the door, shrugged and raised his eyebrows. Take the bastard, Ruinov mumbled, before he turns my command into an abattoir. Soft jazz filled the night air. piped into the living room, where the guests mingled, and out to the backyard, where couples danced and dined off the lush buffet. Despite the music and the soothing ambience, Patricia Nelwyn was unhappy. Attendance was required at the quarterly staff cocktail party thrown by Dr. Tabbert, the chief of staff, at his home. And, although she would never admit it, Patricia felt awkward and uncomfortable as the one unattached woman under 60 at the affair. It was a time for office politicking, networking, and good old-fashioned sucking up. In her professional life, Patricia had set her goals high. First in her class at Harvard Medical School, she'd become a board-certified, practicing psychiatrist before her 30th birthday. And in the last 7 years, she'd published 2 major papers on personality disorders, culminating in her appointment as a junior staff member of the Volker Institute here in Munich, one of the top facilities of its kind in the world. But she was driven, often working 20-hour days, forgetting that a world or a lover existed outside her research. She'd never been any good at the social graces, and she had no patience for a relationship. Which brought her back to the party around her. Patricia had spent days preparing. Perfect dress, the perfect conversation pieces, and, most importantly, the perfect escort. Their relationship had been fraying, but she'd begged her current lover, a naval attaché, to accompany her. This was going to be her big move, until his late afternoon call had forced the issue. In fact, many issues, and she hated confronting her own issues. In a fit of fury, the conservative, acceptable dress had been scrapped. In its place, a clinging, sequined dress, deep red with a low scoop neck and high slit. She knew that they'd talk. Why would a beautiful girl like that come alone? Might as well give them something to talk about. She nursed her single drink of the evening and watched the clock move. "Well, well," a deep man's voice said from behind her. "If it isn't Clinical Patty all decked out." She angrily whirled around, then laughed as she recognized the source of the voice. "I didn't know you were back yet, Jack." Dr. Jack Clemente, 67 years old, 150 pounds spread sparingly across his 6'4" frame, was director of behavioral research and Patricia's boss. He took a drink from a passing waiter. "We flew in late this afternoon." "How's Jenny?" He smiled. "Fine." He pointed across the patio at a short, heavy-set woman at the buffet. Then he paused as a coughing fit came over him and held a handkerchief over his mouth. It was an open secret that Jack had cancer, but he had yet to announce it officially, and his colleagues respected his privacy. Jenny came up to them. The 2 women embraced warmly. "How was Washington?" Patricia asked. Jenny shrugged. "I wouldn't know. I spend my time in the malls." Patricia looked at Jack. "I thought you 2 were on vacation." She turned to Jenny. "What happened?" "We're there 3 hours," Jenny said readily, covertly handing Jack a clean handkerchief. "When Jack gets a call from the Pentagon, next thing I know, he spends every day locked up in stupid meetings." Now Patricia was intrigued. "So, old pal," she said, nudging him, "what gives?" Jack smiled slightly, gave his wife an annoyed look, then turned back to the young woman. "You know how it goes, Patty. The U.S. government gives us over half the Institute's grants and aid. Somebody over there gets a harebrained idea, they call the Institute, and the Institute calls me." He paused. Then, as if he were giving in, his voice dropped low and conspiratorial. "There's something special coming up. It's getting the Defense Department's highest priority, virtually unlimited funding, not to mention the tightest security." "What field?" she pressed. "Well, you remember the Eisenreich study on the effects of prolonged stress on type A3 personalities?" She nodded eagerly. "Aberrant behavior reflexes, decompensation lability syndrome, phased atavism. That's my field, Jack." Jack nodded. "How many of the conditions manifested in how many subjects?" "All in one." "One? All in one? You've got to let me in on this." Jack held up his hand. "It's not my call. Staffing decisions will be made by the chief in consultation with the Department of Defense project manager.
Patricia's mind was racing. Chief decides? She suddenly looked down at herself and let out a quiet yelp. She looked back at Jack. What about the project manager? The DOD project manager, who's that? Jack looked around the yard, finally spotting the person he was looking for.
That rather self-important-looking gentleman by the buffet.
Navy suit, red power tie, Jenny added casually. He flew back with us. Without taking her eyes off the man, Patricia started across the yard. Jenny watched her go. I didn't much like doing that, Jack. Is all this game-playing really necessary? Jack looked over at the man by the buffet.
He seems to think so.
The man in the blue suit was in his 50s, tall, powerfully built, a deeply tanned, heavily lined face with dark circles under his eyes. His posture was ramrod straight, his black leather shoes polished to within an inch of their life. He was line military, Patricia realized, not civilian DOD, and he was sniffing at the plate the waiter had just handed him. She smiled as she casually walked up to him. There's a door prize for the person who can come closest to identifying the main entree. He looked over at her briefly, then back to his plate. I don't have a clue. I don't recall seeing you around here before.
My name's Alex Beck. They shook hands.
Patricia. Dr. Patricia Nelwyn.
I just arrived today.
He looked out at the party.
In fact, other than Dr. Tabbert and Dr. Clementi, you're the only person here I've met. Are you connected with the Institute?
Finally, an opening she could use. I work in the Behavioral Research Center with Jack Clementi. He seemed suddenly interested.
Really?
For the last 4 years.
I may be doing some work with some of your people. That's why I'm here.
Well, she said eagerly, if behavioral research is what you're looking for, we have some of the best minds in the business.
Beck smiled. Are you one of them? She tried to sound demure.
I like to think so.
He suddenly looked at her with a piercing stare. Tell me, what do you know about unlearning instinctive behavior? Is it possible?
Sure. Anybody can be conditioned to do anything.
What about survival behaviors?
Why not? Harder to do, but the same principle.
How?
Patricia recognized a chance to impress the man. 2 ways. 1, behavior modification using positive and negative stimulus, like touching a hot light bulb. You give the subject an even more unpleasant experience every time he refuses to touch the bulb. Then give an overwhelmingly pleasant experience when he does. After a while, if the positive reinforcement is strong enough, he'll go around looking for bulbs to touch just to get the reward.
And be left with charred hands.
She shrugged. An unfortunate byproduct.
Beck seemed deep in thought.
What's the other way? Chemically induced post-hypnotic suggestion. Plant an idea deep enough in a subject's subconscious, and they'll happily put a shotgun in their mouth and pull the trigger, just because they've become convinced that it'll clear up their sore throat.
Beck looked off into the distance. The problem with both your suggestions, Doctor, is that either way you're left with an essentially deformed, vulnerable individual. Beck turned back to her. Now, 95% of survival behaviors are avoidance, right?
Right.
But what if you had a subject where 95% of the survival behaviors were aggressive? His voice had taken on a pleading tone. Could you remove those behaviors and leave the individual intact?
The experts would say no.
So I've been told, Beck said quietly, looking down. Dr. Clementi thinks it would be a long shot at best. She thought carefully before responding.
Jack's a brilliant clinician. No disrespect intended, but breaking new ground isn't his strong suit.
Beck was smiling again. And it is yours. Clinical Patty emerged, full-blown.
Look, I don't know any of the details of your project, but I know one thing. You need someone open to new ideas and unconventional thinking.
Really? He sounded amused. He turned to leave. It was a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Nelwyn.
Listen, she pressed. You screw around using conventional therapies with a full-blown DLS with phased atavism, you're going to end up with one of two things, a dead man or a vegetable. Beck looked into the young woman's eyes. A shadow seemed to pass over his face. I assure you, Doctor, the latter will never happen. He walked away. Patricia just stood there, her mind awash with their conversation. She didn't notice when Jack came up behind her.
So, how'd it go?
Maybe I can get work as a hooker, she said in a quiet voice.
Well, at least you have the dress for it.
The next morning, Patricia kept her head down as she headed for the safety of her office. Dr. Nelwyn? A nurse came over to her. The chief's been paging you. He wants to see you. Shit, Patricia grimaced as she headed back to the elevator. Dr. Klaus Manfred Tabbert, chief of staff of the Volker Institute, sat smiling pleasantly behind his highly polished, oversized desk. Not an inch of its mirror-like surface was covered by a loose sheet of paper or the slightest smear. Good morning, Dr. Nelly. Good morning, sir. She sat down in front of the desk. Dr. Nellin, are you happy here? Yes, sir, very happy. At times I wonder. You're a brilliant, perhaps gifted practitioner. Your clinical record is beyond reproach, but in areas beyond the clinic, I feel you are not institute material. Really? Her voice was flat, angry. You say my work is brilliant, gifted. Well, that's what you pay me for. Patricia looked at him, trying to decide if she'd prefer a job at some Midwestern med school, or maybe a mental health clinic. Tabbert gripped the edge of his desk. Dr. Nelvin, if it were left to me, you would not finish the day. But the board of directors believes, rather naively in my opinion, that your gender has been discriminated against. And so you are here. There's nothing I can do about that. He stood up. In the meantime, there are also certain material realities I must take into account. I cannot conceive why, but your presence has been requested by Dr. Clemente on a special project for the Americans that he is overseeing. You may report to him immediately. Patricia sat there, stunned. Good old Jack had come through after all. She almost knocked Clemente over as she burst into his office and embraced him. Jack, you beautiful, brilliant, terrific person. Thank you. Jack held up his hands.
Not me.
Then who? She unconsciously took a step back when she saw Beck sitting in a chair across the room. He stood up and walked over to them.
What I was trying to say, Jack began, is that it wasn't my decision.
Beck shrugged. You seem the right person for the job, Dr. Nelwyn. But last night, I thought... Time for explanations later. Right now, we have a plane to catch. 10 hours later, at the Czech frontier, the three of them stood on the German side of the border, leaning on an ambulance. Beck's explanations had been brief, and the closer they had gotten to their destination, the more close-mouthed he had become. They were met by a squad of heavily armed American soldiers. Beck had spoken to them briefly, and they had melted away into the shadows. Now he just stood, staring across the border. The sound of a truck filled the air. A moment later it could be seen pulling to a stop on the Czech side. A man in uniform got out and walked across the border. Patricia flinched as she heard automatic rifles being cocked around her. Beck walked up to the man. Alexander Beck. Major Valery Vyatenka. Vyatenka handed Beck a thick folder. They spoke in low tones for a couple of minutes, then Vyatenka turned and waved to the truck. It started slowly across, pulling to a stop near the ambulance. Patricia watched, spellbound, as the back gate was dropped and a man inched forward from the truck's depths. Chained hand and foot, and from his neck to his waist, he was helped down by two Russian soldiers who immediately picked up their rifles, pointing them at him. He looked around, then slowly shuffled toward the ambulance. Vyatenka watched the man pass, then turned to Beck. If you unlock him before my men and I are well clear of this place, my snipers will cut him down. He turned, striding quickly back to the truck. A moment later, it sped away. Beck stood in silence next to the chained man. "So, Alex." Newman looked deeply into Beck's soul. Beck desperately wanted to, but he couldn't look away from those intense, accusing eyes. He took a deep breath, then signaled. Patricia watched in fascination as keys were matched to locks, and Newman was set free. He slowly straightened, stretching cramped muscles. Then he turned to Beck. "Did he, say general?" Beck nodded slightly. "For a couple of years now. How are you, Brian?" Newman shook his head sadly. "General. Well, I'm sure your man earned the stars for you." He turned, spotting Jack and Patricia for the first time. "Who are they?" Beck put his hand on Newman's shoulder. "They're here to help." Newman looked down at the hand, then back at Beck. "Help me? Or you?" On the floor of the small amphitheater, a lectern stood, flanked by Beck and Patricia on one side, Clemente and Tabbert on the other. 20 orderlies, nurses, psychiatric social workers, and technicians filled the first few rows. Patricia, her hair tied straight back, was wearing a lab coat covering an ankle-length skirt and utilitarian blouse. Tabbert approached the podium. "Good morning, colleagues. You have each been selected for this appointment on the basis of your record, qualifications, and accomplishments. You are all to be congratulated." Few in the audience paid attention. The main show would begin only after Tabbert left. When he'd finished, the little man bowed at Clemente and Beck, noticeably ignoring Patricia, then walked briskly from the room. Jack took over the podium and smiled out at the audience. "Good morning." They all came to attention, pens poised over pads. "A couple of ground rules. This project is classified at the highest levels. Since all of you here have worked under similar security before, I won't bother to go over the rules. Read your copies. Our task here is threefold. First, answer this question. What do you get when you take a Type A3 personality, thoroughly train him in the arcane arts of deep penetration intelligence work, then subject him to over 6 years of solitary confinement in one of the harshest penal environments in the world? Second, find a way to undo whatever psychic damage his captivity did to him. Third, and this is the hard one, folks, return the subject to as close to normalcy as possible." He turned and nodded at Patricia. She walked to the podium and began. "Our course of treatment is unclear at this point, but if we can rely on the record, 4 points are manifestly clear." She opened the file. 1. We must limit access to the subject. Until we are convinced that his violent lapses are under control, only Dr. Clemente, myself, as well as 1 nurse and orderly per shift will be allowed in contact with him. 2. Due to the subject's very high intelligence, we must constantly question whether his demeanor and actions are true reflections of his emotional state or merely sophisticated masks to lull us into a false sense of security. 3. A preliminary diagnosis of decompensation lability syndrome has been arrived at. Since this is a relatively rare condition, I expect you all to read up on it. 4. Most important, never, under any circumstances, confront the patient over anything. Never paint him into a corner. Over and above his aberrant behavior reflexes and phased atavism, he has been trained to the finest edge to respond to confrontation with overwhelming force and violence. As the project briefing continued, a briefing of another kind was taking place inside Unit A-249. On the edge of the Institute's vast lawn, less than 100 meters from the woods, The small, solitary building looked from the outside like a German hunting lodge. The windows were tinted, preventing anyone from looking in, and the doors were always locked. Inside, the visitors found the pastoral setting quickly forgotten. The ground floor had stark white walls and utilitarian carpet. There was a full nurses' station. Just off the station was a room containing a bank of monitors and sound equipment that eavesdropped on what appeared to be patient rooms. On the second floor were office suites and a conference room. An elevator, its disguised doors behind the nurses' station, ran noiselessly among the floors. It led directly to a small antechamber outside the patient's suite, which was deep below the building, about 3 stories down, and surrounded by reinforced concrete walls. The antechamber featured an intercom and a television monitor that displayed the interior of the suite. The door to the suite was steel-reinforced, barred, dead-bolted, and required 2 keys to open. The suite itself was comfortable, and the main living area had a spacious feel to it, except that everything was bolted down and secured. Outside the unit, Conrad Adel, head of the Institute's elaborate security force and elder of his church, was torn by the dichotomy of the job ahead. He'd read Newman's file, at least the part he'd been given, and he agreed in principle with the decision to house him in this most maximum of maximum security units. The man's potential for mayhem was truly frightening. But he also felt that there was something very wrong with it. A veteran agent of Germany's Grenzschutzgruppen 9, Adel had been on the front lines of his country's battle against terrorism and communism. He'd seen many snap under 1/10 of the pressure this Newman had been subjected to. And yet, if the file was to be believed, Newman hadn't snapped. Far from it. He had completed every task assigned him. Then, once in the hands of the bastard Russians, he had kept faith. If lives were taken by Newman in the process, then, to Adel's mind, it was a soldier doing his duty. And for those sacrifices, Newman was to be almost literally buried alive, prodded and pushed by head-shrinkers who had never risked anything. He turned to the men as they emerged from their tour of the unit, making a mental note to say a special prayer at this Wednesday's Bible study for Brian Newman. "Come to attention!" The former soldiers and cops that made up one of the highest-paid private security forces in Germany snapped to. "Gentlemen, the patient will be transferred at 1500. Condition 1 security will be observed throughout." He held up a finger. "However, you will demonstrate respect for the man at all times. Where there is no conflict with your orders, endeavor to make his confinement as livable as possible. Always remember that he is a comrade in arms, even as we must confine him," he continued sadly, "for his own benefit. Remember the words of our beloved Savior. And should you not have compassion on your fellow servant, as I have had on you." Dismiss. Back in the amphitheater, Dr. Clementi was finishing up the briefing.
An exemplary recruit with extremely high leadership qualities, he was recommended for officers' candidate school. But shortly thereafter, he was court-martialed for crippling a drill instructor who he believed was being unfair to him. Prior to trial, he was recruited for the Deep Penetration Project. It is my personal opinion that the initial recruitment diagnosis was premature, though the test results are strikingly similar to that of a sociopath.
He began to read from a paper.
There exists a marked discrepancy between his intelligence and his conscience development. He is egocentrically impulsive. He has shown an inability to learn from previous mistakes, except...
He looked up.
And this exception is striking in and of itself, except by learning to exploit people and to escape punishment. He is hedonistic. He is charming and likable, but beneath that facade, cynical and remorseless in his dealings with others. But I must remind you, in closing, that his enlisting in the military, then joining the deep penetration program, seems to fly in the face of that diagnosis. Furthermore, he had plenty of opportunities to escape, yet he continually returned after completing his assignments admirably, an act inconsistent with sociopathy. Therefore, assume nothing when dealing with him. Take no chances, but ignore no possible area of inquiry. Questions?
A psychiatrist in the first row addressed Beck.
The Russians are remarkably vague as to what he was doing at the time of his arrest. It might help to know what his assignment was and how well he accomplished it.
Beck hesitated.
It was strategic in nature. Can you be more specific? Suffice it to say that his mission involved slowing the Soviet industrial base to create shortages, hopefully leading to civic unrest and pressure on the communist infrastructure. How does one man do that?
Someone else asked. Hypothetically?
Okay.
In theory, a sufficient disruption in the power grid of a highly industrialized province such as Abkhaz, where most heavy industries' spare parts were manufactured, would cause the supply of spare parts across the Soviet Union to dwindle to a near-complete industrial shutdown. The entire audience was looking up at Beck. Something in the man's manner suggested that his hypothetical example had far more substance than indicated.
Abkhaz,
an MD said in a far-off way.
Wasn't that where that Russian reactor blew up?
A nervous buzz went through the room.
Yeah,
someone said.
It spread radiation over half of Eastern and Central Europe, not to mention Central Asia. Killed a few thousand people.
When was that? Someone else asked. Beck's expression never changed. Approximately 6.5 years ago. The room was immediately silenced.
General Beck, sir?
An elderly German neurologist held up his hand.
Yes?
The former Soviet establishment has often fabricated information against an individual suspected of espionage. The file indicates 2 escape attempts from the penal colony, a series of attacks on the guards therein, as well as a string of fatalities. Even more troubling, an apparent unprovoked attack on a civilian family resulting in their deaths. General, can you shed any light on the veracity of these accounts?
Beck was quiet for a time, head down, deep in thought.
Dr.
Kopf? The old man said pleasantly.
Dr. Kopf.
Beck continued looking down as he spoke.
While I cannot vouchsafe the contents of the files, I can make certain safe assumptions. Mr. Newman was trained to, and by nature was inclined to, do everything in his power to harass his captors. He was among the best we ever trained. His personal resources and instinctive ingenuity are nothing short of frightening.
He looked up at the doctor.
Did he attempt to escape on at least 2 occasions?
It seems reasonable.
Did he inflict the maximum harm possible to his captors in those attempts?
I would have.
Did he, during one of those escape attempts, attack and kill an innocent family of 4?
A sadness seemed to float slowly down his face. I just don't know. He headed for the door, then turned to face the somber audience. But he is capable of it.
This is the end of Side 1. This program is continued on Side 2 of this cassette.
Did he, during one of those escape attempts, attack and kill an innocent family of 4? I just don't know. But he is capable of it. Beck quickly left the hall. The priority of the moment was air. He stumbled through a door and across the lawn, loosening his tie and unbuttoning the collar with the same hand.
Several deep breaths later, leaning against a tree, he had pulled it back together, for the moment at least. The claustrophobia attacks were coming more often, and they were getting worse. 12 years ago, 15 people, 9 men, 6 women, recruited, trained, deployed, sent as biological guided missiles against enemies real and perceived. 9 were dead. 4 had died in the line, sacrificing themselves to God and country. At least he hoped they saw it that way. But the other 5, they were the ones he saw in his sleep, who stood so close to him they cut off his air. Tony and Joab, suicides after killing their wives and children, had been the first to collapse from whatever internal thing drove them. Then Monica had gone ballistic when a man cut her off in traffic. She'd slammed into his car 5 times before eluding the police, but Beck found her, just as he'd found Chris and then Colleen. He could see the look in their eyes as he blew their brains out. And in that moment, the faces of the 6 still living, Newman and the others still practicing their pestilential skills in the field, would come to him. And he knew he had to help them, somehow find a way to let them live their lives as normal individuals, or, out of his love for them, for what they might have been without him, for what they were because of him, he must kill them. Because in the end, he believed that that was a more humane act than leaving them to crash and burn, as they inevitably must. With Newman, he believed he finally had his chance. It was late, a little before midnight. Patricia sat in an upstairs office working on her notes. She tried to concentrate, but it was so hard. It had been the most exciting day she had spent in years. For the first time she had come face to face with the embodiment of the reasons she'd gotten into psychiatry. Despite the presence of the armed guards, the transfer to Unit A249 had all been routine. Newman's attitude was cooperative and helpful, and restraints were deemed unnecessary. Just outside the unit he had stopped and asked to take a last look around for a few minutes, breathe some unrecirculated air, smell the flowers, you know. Security Chief Adel looked at Clemente and saw no objection. "Of course, sir." Newman stood there, turning slow circles, taking in all the beautiful landscaping of the Institute. "Perhaps," Adel had said quietly, "it will not be long before they allow you regular visits to the gardens. Then, perhaps, your full release. I will pray for that, sir." Patricia turned to the transcript of her first interview, which began at 08:30 the next morning, matching her own impressions to the dry record. Standing outside the door, waiting for the guards to position themselves, she had been filled with the same tremulous emotions she'd felt the first time she'd made love. She signaled for the door to open and stepped inside as the door closed behind her. Newman was standing as instructed, facing away from the door at the entrance to the bedroom. When he heard the bolts thrown, he turned to face her. His expression was wary. "Good morning," Patricia said in her best therapist's voice. "Is it? I wouldn't know down here in my burrow." Taking a deep breath, she walked over to him, extending her hand. "I don't think we ever officially met. I'm Dr. Patricia Nelwyn." Aware that his every move was being monitored, he reached out and shook her hand. Patricia felt relieved by the warm, dry grasp. Newman walked past her, settling in an overstuffed chair. Patricia sat on the couch. "There's going to be a period of readjustment for you after all you've been through. We've been asked to help you with that transition." "I see." His voice was non-committal. "How do you feel?" For the first time since she'd seen him at the Czech frontier, he smiled. "Doctor, if we're going to get along at all, I'm afraid you're going to have to expand your horizons beyond basic clinical interviews 101. "In what way?" she asked, noting the arrogant tone. "Don't waste my time with useless pleasantries. Let's just do what we have to do as quickly and efficiently as we can." Quickly and efficiently. A clear reference, she believed, to his fear that she might discover some of his secrets. She felt encouraged. Do you know why you're here? He leaned back and closed his eyes. Any number of reasons. The gamut from your patently absurd declaration of transitional counseling to incarceration pending execution. You think someone wants to kill you? Possibly. Why? Why does anyone kill? I haven't had any experience at it. Maybe you could enlighten me. He opened his eyes to look at her without sitting up. We're all killers, Doctor. You ever swat a fly, step on a bug, drown your piano teacher? I took accordion, Patricia said lightly. He gave her a look of genuine distaste. Figures. So, she said, smiling at him, the killing of a fly is equivalent to the killing of a man? He shrugged. A fly lives, breathes, procreates, has consciousness, has purpose. Your rolled-up newspaper takes all that away with considerably more pain and mess than a lamp cord wrapped around the throat. So why would anyone want to kill you? He sighed deeply. They would want me killed for the same reason you killed the fly. It makes you feel good to be rid of an annoyance. And you think this is what's going to happen? She asked softly. He sat up so suddenly that she jumped. He smiled at his small triumph over her. Not really. Why would they want to kill me? They're the good guys, right? But it is an interesting speculation, don't you think? So, why are you here? She asked, covering her nervousness by making a note. Newman folded his hands in front of him. He appeared to be deep in thought. It would be pure speculation on my part, he said after a while. I wouldn't want to take up your time. We have plenty of time, she said gently, sensing they were near some kind of admission. He stood up, moving back toward the bedroom, picking up a magazine as he went. Excellent, he said in a sarcastic tone. Challenge the patient. Superior clinical technique, Doctor. She ignored the tone. Why do you think you're here? He paused in the bedroom doorway. I suspect that something's gone very wrong with the program, he said, with a tinge of sadness and something else. Worry or self-concern, maybe. And I'm here, he said slowly, for you to find out what and try to fix it. Exhausted, Patricia stopped reading. There was so much going on in Newman, so many contradictory patterns. She was more lost than ever. Two things she was sure of. Newman was an intelligent, skilled game player with at least some psychoanalytic knowledge. Conventional approaches wouldn't work. Second, perhaps more important, Newman was a highly dangerous man. He had simply decided that the rules of society didn't apply to him, thus he was capable of anything. On her way home, a new, even more disturbing concept echoed through her brain. If, as theorized, Newman had decided, after considering all the alternatives, he would live a remorseless, hedonistic existence, was he really mentally ill? Or was he something new? Some sort of new man that so terrified society that it demanded he be burned at the stake. For 2 hours now, Newman had, with closed eyes, lain there, gradually slowing his breathing, allowing his body to slowly unkink itself. It was difficult, painstaking work, but he'd had 6.5 years to perfect the technique. He heard the camera whine as it pulled back, the unseen watcher having been convinced that Newman was dead to the world. Only now did he allow his mind to turn back to the problem at hand. Escape. The hours spent in the holding area in the main building had been instructive. From his upper-floor window he'd been able to see most of the rear area of the Institute, including the building he was now housed in. He'd watched the casual patrols of the staff security, seen which lights came on when. Then there were the distances involved.
Some he'd carefully paced off whenever they'd moved him, and some he'd had to estimate. There was still the question of how deep the woods were and what lay beyond them, but he now knew exactly how long it would take him to reach any given point on the grounds from the main door of the unit. Satisfied, he rolled over to a new position and new problem: how to get to the main door of the unit. A straight force approach was out. He would have to get them to allow him out of the unit, lower their vigilance, and buy 5 minutes of unencumbered time. He began to evaluate those staff members he'd been able to observe close up. Clemente was a traditional shrink, his techniques tried and true. He was cautious, experienced, conservative. He was consigned to a back burner. Nelwyn. Now she was interesting. She'd allowed him to dominate their interview, and that was intriguing. The sharpest of the bunch by far, she tended toward the unconventional, but she was underappreciated and far less confident than she pretended. With all her heart and soul, she wanted not only to be right, but to display her rightness. Beneath her cool professional detachment, she believed herself to be a chrysalis, an ugly caterpillar on the verge of becoming a beautiful butterfly, yet somehow unable to ever pull it off. So she spread her multicolored wings only in her mind. But if someone else were to see her as a butterfly, front burner for her. The security chief, Adel, was probably career soldier or police. He seemed tough, honest, brave, and, unfortunately for him, compassionate. Front burner, but toward the rear. Newman would have to remind himself to reread the Bible. That's where the key to Adel was. Finally, for the 100th time since his release, he turned his attention to Alexander Beck. Beck's guilt was obvious. The man seemed like a porcelain doll that had been dropped one too many times. Riddled with hairline cracks, he was held together by force of will, discipline, and routine. He needed a complete, soulful forgiveness, like a child begging for Mommy to kiss it and make it all better. No question, Newman thought, Beck was the weak link. After Beck, there was Nelwyn, then possibly Adel. Then he was asleep. It was almost 3 o'clock in the morning. Patricia watched videos to banish thoughts of Newman from her mind, at least enough to let her sleep. But in the early morning hours, unbidden, the questions returned, so she had gone back to the transcript. Patricia had known Newman's walking away was a test. He expected to be abandoned, as he felt he had been in Russia, so to avoid that pain he would do the abandoning, be the first to leave. So she waited, a full 11 minutes before he returned. "Still here?" he asked affably as he returned his magazine to the table. "Yep." "I suppose you have a reason?" "I want to help." "Why?" I know you must be getting a ton of money from Uncle." He collapsed back into the chair. "How much am I worth, by the way?" He sounded genuinely interested. "They don't tell us peasants things like that," she said with a smile. "But it must be quite a bit. Our institute doesn't come cheap. Add in the number of people that have been assigned just to your care, and it stands to reason that somebody must care about you one heck of a lot." "Not me. The program." "Would they really go to all this length," she said with a smile, "if all they cared about was the program?" "You don't know them." "So educate me." "Do you know anything about great white sharks?" His voice was so subdued that she had to strain to hear it. "Not much." He nodded. "Carcharodon carcharius. They're solitary creatures. No one knows how long they live. All they do is swim, eat, and procreate." His expression was far away. "Put an injured fish in a choppy sea, and the great white will sense it from 100 miles away. They'll navigate flawlessly to get to it. When the shark arrives, despite its obvious advantage, it waits, circling until it's sure that its prey can't put up a fight. Only then does it strike, usually from behind. Patricia fought the desire to make copious notes at this psychic unveiling. Clearly, the great white shark, the most feared terror of the oceans, was an analogy for himself. Now, 15 million years ago, he went on, there was an ancestor of the great white, Carcharodon megalodon. It was as much as 10 times larger than the ones we know today. Nothing could stand in its way. He paused, chuckling bitterly. Let alone a little wounded fish. She nodded gravely. And you feel that you have become this megalodon, and you expect that those who created you now fear you and must kill you. I understand. Newman wearily shook his head. I'm afraid not, Doctor. The megalodon is the people I work for, the government, yours and mine. Me? I'm just a wounded fish. Standing on the roof of the main building of the Institute, Jack Clementi was looking up at the stars, contemplating eternity. I thought I'd find you up here, Patricia said as she came through the stairway door. Meeting's in 10 minutes. I know. A fit of coughing came over him. Finally, when it passed, he reached out and took her hand. You came up here for a reason? She nodded, tight-lipped. Why do you think Tabert's called this meeting? Other than to hear himself talk? You tell me. Well, as head of the Institute, he wants an in-depth progress report on the project, but he has something up his sleeve. Jack nodded. Think. Why today? Why 9 o'clock at night? Today? Tonight? Damn! Beck gets back tomorrow, right? With the review board from Washington. She paused. Tabert's decided to take over the presentation. He's going to kill the project. The sickly man straightened and put his arm around her shoulders. Unless we, meaning you, can convince him otherwise. She looked shocked. Me? He hates me. Barely listens to anything I have to say. Then make him listen. He smiled a crooked smile. Tell him about the pigeon. Tabbert sat at the head of the conference table, a pad pristinely empty sitting beneath a capped pen. Dr. Clementi, sir, if you would like to begin? Clementi took a sip of water, then began. We have just completed our 12th week of observation and preliminary treatment of our subject. All requested neurological and brain imaging studies have been completed. He turned to the old German neurologist from the preliminary briefing. Dr. Kopp? Kopp flipped through a file. To date, our findings are non-striking. He has no mass lesions, no tumors, no temporal displacement. His brain appears to be of average size, with no distinct malformations. Then, Dr. Kopp, Tabbert asked, it is your judgment that there's no physiological cause for the violent episodes? Kopp shook his head. Not in the constructs of the brain, no. Tabbert made a detailed note, then nodded at Clementi to continue. We have also nearly concluded all of our blood and fluid work. Clementi turned to a man across the table from him. Dr. Gettering? Gettering read from his file. Blood work is normal in all respects. We can find no contributory factors to account for any aberrant behaviors. He closed the file and looked down. No contributory factors? Tabbert said as he wrote. Clementi continued. We've run every psych test we can think of on him, most of them twice, some 3 times. The results were undramatic. Tabbert immediately looked up. Undramatic? Indeed. Would you be so kind as to define your terms, Dr. Clementi? Clementi took a deep breath. His IQ is 185, well above genius. He types out as A3 with a grade of 7 of a possible 10 on the Kiernan Violence Index. There are no obvious signs of neurosis, psychosis, manias, or dementias. Clementi wiped his face with a handkerchief. I can assure you there's something there. I have had 48 clinical sessions with him. The man is arrogant to the point of absurdity. He seems to have acquired a background in the psychoanalytic technique and revels in allowing only glimpses of the real person beneath the facade.
Dr. Clementi, precisely what conditions or maladies did you glimpse beneath this so-called facade?
Clementi exhaled deeply. By any conventional definition, there is no name for them. But the symptoms and the condition do exist, I'm sure of that.
The Chief of Staff looked down at his notes.
I have heard nothing to alter my impressions so far. Therefore, sir,
Patricia said.
The Chief looked at her.
I believe I've heard enough, Dr. Nelvin. Dr. Clementi speaks for the behavioral unit and for the project. I quite understand, sir. As the primary therapist on the grant, I'll just submit my report to the review board separately. You will what?
Talbert's face grew red.
If you're too busy, I'll just present it to the board myself.
A vein started throbbing in Talbert's forehead.
You may begin, Doctor. In the past 3 months, I have had 61 conversational sessions with Mr. Newman. While I also have been unable to identify any conventional condition, I fully agree with Dr. Clementi that something is there. And of course you have no evidence of this? On the contrary, she said lightly. I have the pigeon. Actually, 1 pigeon and 1 cat.
It had happened at the end of the 2nd month. The therapy sessions were getting nowhere. The tests were coming back negative. Even the round-the-clock observation of Newman revealed nothing. And yet there was some unknown thing always lurking just beneath the surface, laughing at their inability to find it. So a plan had been developed. As usual, Patricia stepped into his quarters at 8:30.
Good morning,
she said as he turned around. He froze halfway. The door, always instantly closed behind her, remained open.
I thought we'd have today's session outside,
she'd said pleasantly. She didn't think one human being could be so still. Only his eyes moved slowly back and forth between her and the open door. Guards? He asked softly. She shrugged.
This trip, I'm afraid, it'll be pretty much like when we brought you down here. If you follow the rules, they'll keep their distance and allow us our session in confidence.
His breathing seemed shallow. His muscles were contracted. Everything about the man screamed tension and preparedness. Inside, Patricia was rejoicing. This was a Newman they'd never seen before, who probably most approximated the man who had been in Russia. Newman's mind was racing. It briefly occurred to him that this was a setup to shoot him down, trying to escape. But he had to get to the outside.
After you, Doctor.
Under guard, Newman followed her out of his quarters. He reconfirmed his earlier timing of the elevator. As they came to the open door, he could see guards spread out in a loose semicircle about 60 yards in front of the building. The security chief approached.
Good morning,
Adel said pleasantly.
It seems our prayers have been answered.
Newman nodded.
Depending. There are no tricks here, sir,
Adel went on in a sincere voice.
If you do not attempt to escape or cause harm, my men will keep their distance. If, by some unexpected stroke of luck, you were able to get past the perimeter, my men on the roof would cut you down before you got 20 meters.
Newman's opinion of the German security chief grew by the minute. He smiled at Adel.
Wonderful are thy works. Thou knowest me right well.
Adel grinned.
You have been reading your Bible?
Psalms, Newman said lightly.
139:14.
He paused.
It helps pass the time.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Perhaps we could discuss your readings sometime.
I'd like that.
Adel nodded, half bowed to Patricia, then left to join his men.
Slowly, Newman stepped out into the sun. For 10 minutes they walked slowly around the building. Newman seemed calm and relaxed, breathing the fresh air deeply, quietly taking it all in. Patricia was exhilarated.
She hoped he wasn't being overwhelmed by the experience. He wasn't. All of his defenses were going full out.
"Shall we begin?" she asked.
"As long as we can keep walking. I need the exercise." And a closer look around the rest of the perimeter, he thought.
"We were talking about anger."
A waste of time, really.
"Why?"
"Well," he said slowly,
"Define anger." "Okay. It's a strong passion or emotion of displeasure, and usually antagonism, excited by a sense of injury or insult."
She paused.
"How'd I do?"
He clapped lightly. "Brava! Except you left some things out. Anger raises blood pressure, cuts down the flow of oxygen to the brain, contracts the major muscle groups, generally debilitates the body in a painfully short time." Patricia nodded.
"But what about it serving as a release? Anger unexpressed can be even more harmful."
"I disagree. It's not the suppression of the anger that's harmful. It's the fact that the root cause remains unchained when anger is checked at the door."
"You lost me,"
she said honestly. He sat down on the grass where he could see through a parting in the trees in the woods. She sat down beside him. "Well," he said, "when we give our anger voice through its fury or hurt or pain, it begins to resolve the problem. But why allow all that pain and anguish?" He noticed a cat about to pounce on a pigeon, when you can avoid it by just addressing the problem up front. Patricia followed his gaze. The cat jumped, hitting the pigeon in the wing. The injured bird managed to make it to a low branch of a nearby tree. Newman looked over at Adel and pointed at the pigeon. "Okay if I check that out?" Adel nodded and redeployed his men, keeping the bulk of them between Newman and the woods. Newman stopped 10 feet from the tree. "Don't move," he said softly. Patricia watched in fascination as Newman moved slowly forward, slowly reaching up toward the injured bird. Everything about him was calm, unthreatening. The bird seemed to sense this and didn't resist as he gently lifted it off the branch. He stroked the pigeon's feathers. "Wings broken," he said in a soothing voice. He turned to Patricia. "When something is in pain and no one gives a shit about it, that offends me and injures me." He shrugged. "But I don't get angry. I deal with it." Newman grabbed the bird's head, gave it a quick twist, snapping its neck. He dropped the instantly dead bird to the ground. The guards flinched. Adel nodded. Patricia stood transfixed. Newman continued as if nothing had happened. "No anger, no rage, just observation. I saw the bird attacked but not killed. Analysis. I saw that it was in pain and could not recover from its wounds. Then action. I put it out of its pain." The cat walked up to them, rubbing against Newman's legs. He looked down at it and smiled. "I felt no more anger at that bird than he did," he said, nodding at the cat. "Of course—" He suddenly raised his foot and smashed it down on the cat's head, crushing its skull. Its body lay twitching on the grass for several moments before it became still. Newman looked over at an ashen-faced Patricia. "Of course," he said casually, "cats really piss me off." The conference room was stunned into silence. "What are your explanations for this rather unusual event?" Hubbard asked. "We've arrived at 4 possible explanations," Jack said. He turned to the older neurologist. "Dr. Koff?" "Examine this sequence of events. A discussion of anger, its roots and outlets. The subject begins to lecture the therapist on anger avoidance. Then, as if to illustrate a point, he puts the injured bird out of its evident misery. He doesn't appear to be angry about the cat's unprovoked attack. Rather, he acts directly, ending the bird's suffering." "And the cat?" Hubbard asked. "A second demonstration of his argument," the old man continued. Rather than express anger at the cat, he avenges the bird by killing the object he perceives as the cause of the bird's death. Clementi turned to a youngish psychologist near the other end of the table. Dr. Mon? The young man read from his notes. It is my belief that the subject was expressing his contempt for the medical establishment, a group dedicated to healing, by callously killing the two animals in an overt attempt to shock us. He looked over at Tabbert. Tabbert ignored him. Dr. Clementi? Jack smiled sympathetically at the crestfallen young man. My personal view is a combination of the first two, with one minor change. I believe his action in killing the pigeon was genuine. The cat, on the other hand, may well have been a symbol of all of us who are imprisoning him. He has referred to the government as a predator out of control, much as the cat. He saw an opportunity to express his unresolved rage at us indirectly, and he selects the cat as our effigy. Tabbert was making copious notes now. Rubbish, Patricia said quietly. Tabbert quickly looked up. Excuse me, Dr. Nevin? I said rubbish. Might I assume, then, that yours is the fourth hypothesis? She took a deep breath. Yes, with all due respect to Dr. Clementi. Tabbert, having gone into the meeting sure that he could get rid of this odious project easily, was in a tailspin, and yet he was also becoming intrigued by Brian Newman, and disturbed. Go ahead, Dr. Nelvin, but please, be brief. Patricia looked at the faces in the room, all either skeptical or openly hostile, including Clementi. As Dr. Clementi has suggested, she said softly, Newman is not a sociopath. A socio demonstrates an inadequately developed conscience, but as far as I can determine, Newman has never expressed any guilt at anything he's ever done. None, from early childhood on. Newman, I believe, is completely without a conscience. My guess is that he was born that way. I think he killed the pigeon simply to gain some advantage by gaining our respect, demonstrate his kindness in eliminating the animal's suffering. What about the cat? Clementi interrupted. She turned to face her friend and colleague. Newman gave us the answer that day. Cats really piss him off. And being a man without a conscience, he acted to remove the source of his irritation. He knew he could kill the cat without consequence to his inevitable plans, so since he wanted to, he did. And what, pray tell, Tabbert said sarcastically, are his inevitable plans? One day he will try to escape again, and when he does, he will do whatever he has to without the slightest compunction in order to make the attempt successful. His IQ is well above genius. He has an almost infinite ability to learn. Tabbert cleared his throat. Dr. Nelvin, do you believe that the subject is some kind of Ubermensch? Some form of miraculously endowed deviant who can only be stopped by a silver bullet or stake through his heart? No. Her voice was soft but firm. He's no deviant. It was now or never. It is indisputable that man is in a constant state of evolution. What if the current evolution is neurological, within our brains, not an expansion of the tissues, but a reworking of its very essence? Kopp stared at her. Do you realize what you are saying? Man has remained essentially unchanged for well over 300,000 years. She nodded slowly, ignoring the looks from around the table. Australopithecus robustus lived for 200,000 years. Then Homo erectus was unchallenged for another 200,000. Then Homo sapiens arrived. We've had longer runs than either of them. We're actually overdue. Shouts of disbelief, anger, and confusion mixed with the sound of Tabbert hammering on the table for order. Only Clementi, Kopp, and Patricia remained quiet, looking into each other's eyes. The noise subsided. Tabbert stood up. This meeting is over. Dr. Nelvin, If you mention any of your crazy notions outside of this room, I will personally see to it that you never work in the mental health field again. I recommend that you re-enter therapy and examine exactly what your motivations are. For that reason, you are hereby granted an immediate, indefinite leave of absence." He followed the group that was storming out the door. "You really believe that, don't you?" Clementi said slowly. She nodded sadly. He shook his head. "Why?" "It's me, Jack. Just tell me simply and without ego." She looked into his eyes and glimpsed disappointment. "We're in the business," she said, with a cry in her voice, "of defining the indefinable. You said Newman's something we've never seen before, something that defies any conventional explanation." "Yes, but a previously undiagnosed mental disorder." "But why ignore an obvious possibility just because it comes from left field? Even Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes something new is something new." Jack stood. "I don't know," he said softly. He coughed briefly and seemed to slump. "I have to think about it." He turned and slowly walked from the room. "Dr. Nevin, I do not believe your theory is correct." She whirled around, having forgotten that Kopp was still in the room. "However, I may be wrong. The sun does not circle a flat earth. Today's scientific fact is often tomorrow's preposterous history. Man is an evolving creature. One day the next age will begin. We will turn around to see an unfamiliar face or form, and we will shrink from it in fear, as we did today." He gathered his files, and halfway to the door he turned back to her. "It is my hope. No, it is my prayer that this unfamiliar face or form will not be our Mr. Newman. A future of Homo sapiens confronted with Homo crudelis is a dark future indeed." He laughed. "At least for us Homo sapiens." Patricia watched his retreating form, her mind racing to comprehend the old man's words. Homo sapiens, wise man, in an inevitably losing struggle against his predestined replacement. Homo crudelis, cold-hearted man, a hunter-killer with the intellect of modern man, free of old restraints on behavior that we take for granted today. Kopp is right, she thought, as she walked out of the conference room. There is only one possible outcome. The 3-block stretch of the Sigersenstrasse on the edge of Munich, known locally as the Devil's Playground, was noise, neon, cars, and bodies. The garish lights gave everything a reddish-blue tinge, and the smell of sex was everywhere. The man stood smoking a cigarette butt, looking out at the chaos. He took a deep drag, the glowing end burning his fingers. He casually threw it away. Raising his collar against the fall mist and possible identification, he crossed the street and proceeded to the final block of the playground. Here it was cleaner, quieter, and somehow more foreboding. The doormen doffed their caps as he passed. He stopped at number 37 and climbed the steps as the door was opened for him. He walked up to the conservatively dressed older man behind a mahogany counter at the far end of the elegant lobby. "I am Ghislaine," the counterman said in German. "How may I help you, please?" The man handed across a membership card. Ghislaine nodded and spoke in English. "You are most welcome here, sir." He handed him a pale blue card. "May I take your order, sir?" The man took the card, checked off several items, and handed it back. Ghislaine smiled. "Very discerning, sir. In the salons, sir?" The man nodded. Ghislaine pressed a button, causing a door to the left of the counter to open noiselessly. As the man started through the door, Ghislaine called after him. "It is nice to have you with us again, sir." Some minutes later, Isa, dressed in a conservative ankle-length skirt and utilitarian sports blouse, her hair tied straight back, stood outside the door to Salon 24. She took a deep breath, then knocked. "Come in," a deep voice said. She smiled simply upon entering. "Hello? You asked to see me?" Her voice was friendly, but businesslike. The man leaned on the bureau with his back to her. "I think I need some help, Doctor. I get these feelings, urges," his voice was hoarse, "that make me want to do things." Isa pulled out a pad and pen and sat down on a divan. "Why don't you come and sit down beside me?" she said professionally. "We will talk about it." The man slowly turned, walking over to her. He hesitated, but she smiled encouragingly. He sat down. Isa quickly evaluated the man. He was strong, very tall, very fit, but certainly over 50, with dark circles under his eyes. "So, what kind of things?" Isa felt him move closer to her, his leg brushing against hers. She moved a little bit away. "Ugly things," he said, as he pressed up against her again. "Horrible, ugly things. Things I know I can get away with that others can't." He put his hand on her leg, slowly, rubbing it while he began to pull up her skirt. Isa squirmed uncomfortably. "Please, sir, this is not appropriate behavior." He reached up and began fondling her breast. She tried to pull away from him, but he forced her back, powerful hands pinning her to the divan. "I can do anything," he muttered. "Anything. The rules don't apply to me." He tore open her blouse. She tried to push him off her, but he threw her onto the thickly carpeted floor. Pulling her skirt up, he roughly groped her between her legs. "Please, stop," Isa begged. "Don't." She allowed tears to fill her eyes while she measured the man's responses. She hoped she wouldn't have to give the emergency signal to the bodyguard outside the door. He straightened up. "Shut up, bitch! I can do anything, have anything. No one can stop me." He bent down again, roughly lifting her legs. "You will do whatever I tell you to do, won't you?" His voice was thick with violence as he entered her. "I will do whatever you want," Isa groaned out. As his eyes glazed over, as he gasped for breath, he spoke in a vicious whisper. "And call me Newman." "Now remember," Clementi said to the young man as they got out of the elevator, "there's bound to be some shock, anger, whatever at Dr. Nelwyn's replacement. Address that first." "As you say, Doctor," Dr. Moll said happily. This was his chance to show the senior staff just how good he really was, and to prove his theory of the case. After all, these senior people were so out of touch, they wouldn't recognize establishment resentment if it bit them on their spreading asses. Clementi held the younger man by the shoulder. "Remember, we'll be monitoring everything. Say the code word. Use it in a phrase like you would around him, in some way that he wouldn't notice." Moll was bored with all this melodrama. "I would say something like, I was wondering if you ever had a chemical dependency problem. How's that?" "Fine," Clementi said, but he didn't sound convinced. He walked over to the control room where Dr. Kopp was observing Newman through the monitor. Newman, as usual, stood at the entrance to his bedroom with his back to the door. When he heard it close and lock, he turned around, smiling. The smile quickly vanished. "Who are you?" His voice was flat. Moll smiled and held out his hand. "My name is Dr. Pierre Moll. I will be taking over for Dr. Nelwyn for a time." Newman didn't move. "Why?" Moll lowered his hand, but expanded the smile. "I believe she's experiencing something of a family situation. I'm sure she will return as soon as she can. In the meantime, she thought I might be able to substitute in for her, as it were." "As it were," Newman parroted. "It should be less vague," Kopp said in the control room. Newman studied the young man. No white lab coat, but a pale blue shirt with a white collar, paisley tie, longish hair stylishly cut. Harmless yuppie larva. Why had they substituted him in for Nelwyn, and what did it mean for his plans? Mon gestured at the chair. May I sit down? Newman nodded, taking a seat on the far end of the couch. Mon settled himself in the chair. Is there anything you would like to know about me? I thought we might use today's session to get to know each other. Newman nodded. How much do you weigh? Mon was thrown, but he quickly recovered. Interesting question. I weigh approximately 75 kilos. 165 pounds, Newman said quietly. More or less. And yourself? More. Newman stared up at the ceiling. Standard attempt to take control of the conversation, Mon thought. He decided to take a different tack. If I were to concede to you your physical superiority, might we move on to another area? It seemed to work. Newman looked at him and smiled a genuine smile. Why not? He said in a friendly, if still cautious voice. Very good. Mon reached up and loosened his tie. I hate these things, he said casually. But the senior staff around here, they insist. They control how we dress, how we act, even when we're not at the Institute. Newman leaned forward slightly. That doesn't seem right. No? Mon could feel that they were close to establishing a rapport. I mean, Newman continued, you're an individual. You have a right to express yourself in any way you see fit, right? Right. Mon suppressed the urge to yell at the camera, I told you so. Newman slid down the couch until he was within a foot of the young doctor. May I confide in you, Pierre? He leaned forward. You don't mind if I call you Pierre, do you? Not at all, said the excited young man. Pierre? Newman put his arm around him. You asked me why I wanted to know your weight. Well, I'll tell you. He edged closer. I wanted to know exactly how hard it was going to be to throw your lifeless body at the guards as they come rushing in a minute or so from now. He smiled a pleasant smile as he quickly dug his thumb deeply into the young man's neck and raised his hand in front of the man's face. Mon stared at the rock-solid palm that threatened to break his nose and drive the bone fragments into his brain. Newman carefully kept Mon's body between himself and the camera. In the control room, they raised the gain on the microphones. Newman seemed to be whispering to Mon. At that moment, Newman leaned back a bit and smiled up at the camera. Chemical, was all he said. In minutes, an emergency security team stood poised in front of the door to Newman's quarters. After checking the arrangements, Adel returned to the control room. Gentlemen, he said to Clemente and Kopp, he has merely immobilized Dr. Mon and in effect asked to talk. He paused. I believe we should. Clemente said, but he will not respond to any of our calls over the speaker. Adel shook his head and chuckled. No, sir. Put I in his position. Kopp smiled. You are going in there, no? Yes. A minute later, the door opened just enough for Adel to enter and quickly slammed behind him. It is me, Brian. Conrad Adel. Welcome. Adel remained just inside the door. He could see Mon tremble, could smell his fear. We have a difficulty here, Brian. Can you tell me what the problem is? Perhaps together we can resolve it. He stepped another 2 paces into the room. Well, Newman said pleasantly, when you were on assignment in GSG-9 and suddenly they changed your control officer on you without any logical explanation, what would you have thought? That I was being betrayed? Right. Newman stood up, dragging Mon to his feet at the same time. Now, this morning I get up, have breakfast and all, then this jerk shows up for Nelwyn, who supposedly has some personal problems. He paused. Now I ask you, What would you do? His voice was almost amused. Most likely what you have done. He looked up at the camera. Dr. Clemente?
Yes?
Clemente's voice echoed through the room. Would you please tell Mr. Newman the true reason behind Dr. Nelvin's replacement? There was a long silence. Dr. Clemente?
Yes?
This time Adel sounded angry. Do not take the time to fabricate another story. This man is owed the truth. After a moment, Kopp's voice came over the speaker. This is Otto Kopp. Dr. Nelvin advanced an opinion on your case that was met with resistance. As a result, Dr. Talbot has removed her from your case. Oh. Newman released Moll, who collapsed to the floor. Then he looked up at the camera. Now, was that so difficult? Newman released Moll, who collapsed to the floor. Then he looked up at the camera. Now, was that so difficult? Adel half carried the young man to the door. Moll was pulled out of the room and the door relocked. Adel turned back to Newman, who had turned on the television, and sat down on the couch. Is Dr. Nelvin really so important to you? Adel said sociably. Not really. I didn't think so. He sat down next to him. So why all this theater? Newman seemed interested in the program. Would you believe me if I said it was about fair play and mutual respect? No, Adel chuckled. I would not. Newman turned to him and smiled. I knew there was a reason I liked you. He turned back to the program. So, what do you think it was about? Control. Damn straight. Adel stood up, patting Newman on the shoulder. Don't do it again, okay? No surprises from them, none from me. This afternoon, when you are brought up to the conference room, you will behave? Newman laughed. You really think they'll do that now? Adel nodded. I think they are as embarrassed by Dr. Moll's behavior as I am by yours. I'm sorry if I let you down, Newman said in a sad voice. Then he smiled, naturally, with charm. No trouble with the move. You have my word on that. Adel smiled. Try and get some rest. I don't dream. Really? No. Sometimes I remember. Newman seemed distant. Kopp had noticed the mood descend shortly after Adel left. He had walked into the quarters to try and take advantage of it. What do you remember? Pain. Newman's eyes glazed over. His body drooped. I remember school. How is school related to pain? Kopp said gently. School is where I first noticed it. The pain? He shook his head. The difference. Kopp nodded slightly. Being different in school can be most painful. Newman stood and walked over to the bookshelf, staring at it as if it was a window through which he could see. The others grew their hair long, wore wild clothes, flaunted any authority they could find. They didn't care about anything, didn't know anything. But God, they did it all so effortlessly. And you? Nothing was effortless. Newman turned back to Kopp. You think you can get inside me? He smiled a tired smile and sat down again. Maybe this once. He chuckled. We'll call it an experiment, right? His faraway expression returned. By the time I was 10, I'd read and understood the works of Keats, Shelley, and Byron. I'd looked at the stars and understood what they were, where they were, and what they meant. But I was clumsy, awkward, hopelessly naive. I couldn't look a girl in the eye. I realized early on that I didn't see things the way the others all did. It was like I was given more vision than any of them. I kept to myself. I didn't want anyone to notice that I was different. Newman's face lost all expression. It was unnerving, but Kopp showed no sign of it. You speak Japanese? Newman asked. No. Know anything about 8th century Japanese society and customs? No. Imagine waking up one morning
and you suddenly find yourself standing in 8th century Japan. You know you have to get somewhere, but you can't remember where. Newman's face remained expressionless, but anger flowed off of him as if it were a physical thing. People jabber at you in this incomprehensible language. You grab them by the shoulders, shake them as you yell at the top of your voice, "Where am I? Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?" "Now, imagine," he said slowly in a muffled voice, "that you are 13 years old at the time." He paused. "That, Doctor, is pain." Kopf tried to fathom the confusion, the pain of the teenage Newman, trapped in a world that only he could perceive, desperate to make contact with someone, anyone, that could tell him how to deal with these gifts or curses which he could only just begin to perceive. "Go on," he said after a time. "There's not much more." "The pain stopped?" "I made it stop." "Oh." Newman slowly leaned forward. "By realizing that the problem wasn't mine, that it was the other's responsibility to make contact with me, not the other way around. By realizing that through accident of birth, evolutionary prank, or capriciousness of God, there was nothing I couldn't do. That when it came right down to it, my difference, my talents made me strong, stronger than anyone or anything else." The loudspeaker cut off any further discussion.
"Dr. Kopf?"
An unseen voice called. "Yes!" He sounded irritated.
"You are wanted upstairs at the conference, sir."
Reluctantly, Kopf rose, shaking his head, a sad expression spreading across his ancient face. "Mr. Newman, I wonder if you are truly as complex as you would have us believe." Newman shrugged. "Complex is a relative term. The wheel would be considered complex in a society without wheels, routine in one with." They heard the locks being thrown. "And in our society, Mr. Newman, which are you?" Newman's face lost all expression again, and a stillness settled over him. As the door was opening, he turned, heading for the bedroom. "Watch and learn, Doctor," he said as he went. "Watch and learn." Beck and the 5-member Civilian Review Board from Washington had been met at the front entrance of the Institute by Tabbert and Clementi. While Tabbert glad-handed the review board, Clementi took Beck aside. "Do we have time to talk?" One glance at Clementi's concerned expression, and Beck nodded. "I'll make time." They began walking toward the unit. "Have you hurt yourself, General?" Beck had Band-Aids on 2 fingertips. "Just an accident. Minor burn unscrewing a light." Clementi brought Beck up to date. "The question now, General, is, have we damaged our relationship with Mr. Newman beyond repair? Between the incident with the cat and now Dr. Mon." Clementi took a deep breath. Perhaps it would be better for all concerned if Newman were transferred to another facility." Beck shook his head. "Transfer is not an option. Doctor, as far as these 5 bureaucrats are concerned, Newman is just an expensive piece of equipment that's broken down, and they've sent him to experts to repair. If you say you can't do the job, they'll arrange to pick him up, and somewhere between here and nowhere, Brian Newman will be disposed of, efficiently, quietly, permanently." Beck turned away. "Is there any chance of helping Newman?" he said quietly, not at all sure what he wanted the answer to be. "We can't even name the disease, let alone begin to treat it." "If it is a disease." "Patricia's theory is beyond the fantastic." "But would her treatments in any way interfere with your approach?" Clementi shrugged. "I'm not even sure what her treatment would be." "Let's get her back in here and find out." "Tabbert will never go for it." Beck started off across the lawn toward Tabbert and the approaching review board. "Just get her back, now. Let me worry about Tabbert." The board was seated behind a conference table on the 2nd floor of Unit A-249. Clementi and Kopf sat at a small table to their right, Tabbert at another to their left. A 3rd table sat empty, directly in front of them. "Dr. Clementi," one of the board members said icily,
You were with General Beck. Where is he? We've been waiting.
Beck came through the door, followed closely by Patricia.
Gentlemen, if you'll bear with us just another few minutes.
Tabbert jumped up as soon as he saw Patricia and rushed across the room.
I warned you! You are under...
Why don't we take this outside? Beck said, as he gently moved them out the door toward one of the offices.
Dr. Nelwyn, just wait here a minute.
Thank you. As soon as Beck closed the office door, Tabbert turned to him.
That woman has no business...
I asked her to come.
You...
Tabbert paused, trying to control his anger.
Now, you haven't been here for a fortnight. You have no way of knowing. Now listen, you little Nazi bastard.
Beck grabbed Tabbert by his jacket lapels.
I'm sick and tired of all the bullshit I've been getting lately. From Washington, from Clementi, from Newman, now from you.
If you don't get the hell out of the way of the people trying to help. He pulled the little man's face close to his. There's going to be an accident. His voice was chilling.
You're crazier than Newman,
Tabbert said softly as he saw the look in Beck's eyes. That remains to be seen, Beck said quietly. Much as your decision. Slowly, Tabbert nodded.
Dr. Nelwyn is reinstated,
he said in a defeated voice. Beck let go of him. Thank you, Doctor. Very gracious of you. He pulled an envelope out of his jacket and handed it to Tabbert. A check from the DOD. It should cover any inconvenience you think you've suffered. He left the room. Tabbert pocketed the envelope without looking at it. He stood in the office, his mind racing over all the things he could and should do to Beck. But, he told himself, the money from the Americans would allow the Institute to continue much of its very important work, even if good men like himself had to suffer insult from cretins like Beck. Step by step, with Germanic precision, Tabbert took the board through every test and every result. He carefully avoided expressing any opinion or looking at either Beck or Patricia. His presentation was clear, thorough, unbiased. The board paid professional attention to every word, and despite their comical code names, Mr. Red, White, Blue, Green, and Ms. Gray, they at least appeared to understand what was being said. Tabbert looked up at them.
This concludes the strictly medical portion of our studies.
Very well, Ms. Gray said, checking her agenda.
Dr. Clementi is next.
Clementi nodded.
You have my report. There's very little to add to it, except, perhaps, to reinforce the point that at no time, since he was placed in our custody and control, has Mr. Newman demonstrated the atavistic tendencies or decompensation lability syndrome of the original diagnosis. Quite the opposite, in fact. He has been mostly cooperative.
What about the cat? This from Gray.
I mean, if, and I stress that word, DLS and phase atavism are not the diagnosis, what is?
Clementi took a deep breath.
We cannot say with complete confidence at this time.
At that moment he was overtaken by a coughing fit. Kopf quickly poured him some water, but the fit continued. The color drained from the man's face as his handkerchief was stained a thin crimson. Kopf helped Clementi to his feet, and along with Patricia walked him to the door. Clementi turned to Kopf.
Take over, please, Otto.
Kopf nodded as two of the junior staffers led Clementi out toward a waiting nurse. Kopf and Patricia returned to the table. He faced the board.
Lady and gentlemen, our apologies, but Dr. Clementi has not been well for some time.
Kopf took a sip of coffee and carefully studied their faces.
But the incident with the cat suggests a lack of impulse control. When that event is taken in perspective, it is clear that he demonstrated great impulse control, a chosen behavior for a specific effect. As we have eliminated basic psychosis, we must also eliminate schizophrenia and paranoia. Again, because he simply does not display the appropriate symptomology. Is he a sociopath? Only by the strictest definition. He displays no conscience. His intelligence is high, but, and this is critical, he does display a marked moral sensibility. It may not be your morals or mine, but he does possess it.
Mr. Blue looked up.
So, where does that leave us?
Kopf shrugged. With either a new
Here, too, undefined psychiatric or medical ailment involving both the conscience centers and the behavior centers of the brain, or... He paused, then made his decision. This a new man. To Patricia's shock, the board sat there, placidly making notes. Kopp looked at them closely, then merely nodded his head slightly. But then, he said quietly, I believe you have already considered that possibility. The stunned psychiatrists behind him looked over at the review board. Patricia leaned over to him and whispered, Otto. Proceed, Doctor, Miss Gray said quietly. Dr. Nelvin will continue his presentation at this time. As she began, Kopp looked at Patricia, eyes aglow with the prospect of a major paper. Then he thought of Newman, a man racked with an unknown mental disease, or the first of a new breed of men that would have to battle for their survival. It occurred to him that he was the only one thinking of Newman, and a wave of sadness engulfed him. Suddenly he realized that they all had stopped talking. Excuse me? Dr. Kopp, Dr. Nelwyn's thesis would seem to be open to two interpretations, the new disease conjecture and the new man postulate. They are not mutually exclusive, he said. The one is a logical extension of the other. They looked confused. A wheel in a society without wheels might well be considered aberrant, he smiled. But in a more advanced world, the wheel would be considered routine. Time will diagnose Mr. Newman's disease or evolution. White shook his head. I'm afraid this review board does not have time. He turned to his colleagues. Perhaps we should hear from the subject now? They all nodded. I'll have him brought up, Patricia said. One moment, please, Kopp interrupted. His mind raced. Something from his session with Newman had set off alarm bells, and they were clanging now. Watch and learn. Perhaps it would be more advisable for you to go down to his quarters instead. Why? Kopp paused. There's the security aspect. Then there's the question of how a sudden change in environment might affect his treatment. Neither was the real reason. Deep in his soul, he just knew moving Newman would be a mistake. Security Chief Adel, Gray asked, can you address Dr. Kopp's first concern? Adel stood in the back of the room. We have plans in place to bring Mr. Newman to this room. I will escort him personally, and he will be under the guard of 5 of my best men. I can have him shackled during the move and your visit, but I do not believe that will be necessary. Mr. Red turned to Patricia. What about the effects of a sudden change? Negligible, she said firmly. He might be a little defensive at first, but he adapts quickly. I've had close to 100 sessions with the man. We've established a very special rapport, so I'll be able to spot any danger signals before anything might happen. The board talked among themselves for a moment. Then Mr. Blue said, Why don't you talk to him, Dr. Nelwyn, and if you believe he's stable, bring him up. 45 minutes later, as the low sun flooded through the bay window, Newman was escorted in by Patricia, Adel, and 5 security men. As Newman sat down behind the empty table directly in front of the board, Patricia took Kopp aside. He's fine, she whispered. Cooperative, polite, in a good phase right now. She sat down behind Newman. Perhaps, he muttered, as he watched Newman settle himself. Mr. White began. Do you remember your last mission? Yes, sir. And would you recount it to us? Sir, with due respect, you don't tell a stranger you use whips and chains in the bedroom, and you don't talk about your missions in front of them either. White seemed pleased by the answer. If we were to meet in an executive session, would you be willing then? Absolutely, sir. During your captivity, did you ever compromise any operations or personnel of the department? No, sir. Red jumped in. Newman, you know me. Newman nodded. Yes, sir, I do. Red leaned forward to look Newman in the eye. Did you kill any Russian personnel in that damned camp? Newman didn't answer at first. Then he smiled, a cold
angry smile.
I'm sorry, sir. I was just remembering what you said the last time we met. That anyone who would answer a question like that must be crazy. So I'm trying to figure out exactly how to answer you. I wouldn't want to be seen as crazy, would I?
Mr. Newman, Blue said gently, do you consider yourself crazy?
No, sir. Depressed? I'm a little depressed, sir, he said with a sigh. It isn't easy being this close to home and still being locked up and all. Why do you think you are still locked up?
Newman shrugged.
I'm sure you know that far better than I, sir.
The questioning went on in this vein until finally Ms. Gray turned to the board.
Before we continue, I'd like the sense of the board. Is the subject in condition to be debriefed?
Slowly, one by one, they each nodded. Patricia smiled. Kopp noticed the spasmodic smile that played across Newman's lips for the briefest instant, immediately replaced by a blank, open look. All junior staffers, with the exception of Patricia, were cleared from the room. Over Kopp's objections, 3 of the 5 security men were cleared out. Tape recorders were shut off, pencils put down. I would like to remind you, Dr. Nelwyn, Dr. Kopp, and Chief Adel, Ms. Gray said, and you 2 security men, that what you are about to hear is classified on the highest level. They all nodded. Very well. She turned to her right. Mr. Red? Red nodded. Newman, let's talk about Abkhaz 1-5. Newman took on a serious expression. Yes, sir. For the next 3 hours, without a break, they laboriously went over every detail of Newman's last mission. It took its toll on everyone. The board made notes and guzzled coffee. Patricia propped her head on her hands. Adel and his 2 security men constantly shifted from one foot to another, trying to keep alert. Kopp, already exhausted by the tension of the day, found himself drifting off several times. Even Newman seemed not to be exempt from the tedium. He stretched his legs out in front of him, seemed a little drowsy, but continued to answer the ever-coming questions. Finally, Ms. Gray signaled for the last round of questioning to begin. Mr. Green, she said as she wiped at her eyes. Thank you. My questions concern what you have discovered of the construction of the reactor's inner service module. Newman stretched long and hard. This may take a while. He paused, closing his eyes while he thought. Patricia bent her head back and forth to stay awake. Adel took a position by the door and signaled that it was all right for his men to sit down. It was a 2-stage process, Newman began. Initially, there was a chromium hatch set in a composite wall that was perpendicular to the southern bilateral retaining wall. It was only by checking the videotape that anyone was able to reconstruct what happened next. In a quick, spasmodic kick, Newman sent the table in front of him flying on top of the board table. It knocked Mr. Blue and Mr. White backwards, sending the other board members flying. In almost the same movement, Newman rocked forward to his feet. His right hand sent his chair flying backward, past a stunned Patricia and into the lap of the nearest guard. On a straight line toward the window, Newman smashed his forearm and elbow into Beck's forehead without slowing down. As Beck fell backward, Newman grabbed his chair, launching it in a short, vicious arc at the window. As it shattered, Newman dropped to his knees, barely in time to avoid the only shot that Conrad Adel would get off. Newman rolled back to his feet and dived, arms outstretched, through the gaping hole. By the time Adel got to the window, less than 10 seconds had elapsed. But it was too late. Newman was nowhere in sight. Adel recovered first in the commotion and immediately punched the panic button in the conference room. Alarm sirens sounded throughout the compound. Then he dashed for the door, shouting as he went. He prayed that Newman wouldn't kill too many of his men before the night was over. 45 minutes into the search, he wearily returned. Members of the board had either left or were being treated for minor injuries in the Institute's main building. Patricia, Kopp, Tabbert, and Beck were sitting in the deserted conference room. Adel slowly shook his head. We have completed our first pass through the woods and are beginning a second. We have searched all open areas of the property and are now beginning a room-by-room search of the buildings. He collapsed into a chair. I am not hopeful. Beck was rubbing the large welt on his forehead. He had refused treatment. I've already called NATO Security Command in Augsburg, he said wearily. They'll have 2 covert search teams here within the hour. Kopp took a deep breath. And we must notify the authorities. Of what? Talbot asked angrily. We cannot tell the police who Newman is, but we must tell them that a possibly dangerous patient has, left without our approval. We can ask them to keep a lookout, but not approach him, merely notify us if they see him. They all nodded. I will see to that, Adel said as he went to a phone. Kopp stood to leave. Adel? He turned to face Patricia. She was pale, trembling slightly. Newman won't hurt anyone unless he's cornered. I'm sure of it. Her voice was beseeching him. I know the man. Kopp nodded sadly. Zoya said. He turned and left the room. It was almost 4 in the morning. The guards had resumed their regular patrol, the covert search teams had fanned out across the countryside, and the unit had been closed down. Everybody was sworn to secrecy and sent home. Along the edge of the woods, a night bird stirred and winged away at a sound up in one of the still heavily foliated trees. Newman dropped soundlessly to the ground. He remained crouched for several minutes, listening, watching, smelling. Finally satisfied, he slowly stood up and began walking across the lawn toward the main building. As he approached a tree near the unit, some instinct caused him to stop short. He stood there at the ready as an indistinct darkness slowly rose up out of the ground in front of him. It was a man. He tossed aside his camouflage. In his left hand he lightly cradled a Randall assault knife. Newman nodded at him. I have nothing against you. The man took a hesitant step toward Newman. I have my orders. He lunged forward, a snake-like strike at Newman's throat. Newman dropped down, shooting his right leg forward and catching the tip of his foot behind the man's ankle. The man fell backwards. Newman rolled to his right, bringing his left arm in a short, tight whirl toward the man's head. Less than a second later, the man lay dying, his larynx and windpipe crushed. Newman stood up. Pity, he said, and disappeared into the night. The coffee shop was half empty in the late afternoon. 2 men sat alone in a corner booth, as they had almost every Wednesday at this time for the last 9 years. They would sip their coffee, talk softly, then leave separately. The tall man reached out and patted the smaller man's hands. So, my Madalena, what can I tell our friends about the investigation? Talbot, the smaller man, handed an envelope under the table to the tall man. These are the latest report summaries. The tall man pocketed the envelope without looking at it. It seems overly thin. Talbot shrugged. The investigation is likewise thin. Our friends are anxious for more than this, the tall man said in a disappointed tone. It's been over a month now. I don't understand why Moscow is in such a state over one psychotic American agent at large in Germany. But I have heard some small things. Tell me. It seems, Talbot began, then suddenly stopped as a young streetwalker came in and sat down 3 tables away. He continued in a lower voice. It seems that they are about to expand the search abroad and reduce it locally. Washington and NATO Command Brussels are dissatisfied with the results to date and are becoming convinced that Newman must have moved on. And what is the opinion of the search commander? Well, there are to be personnel changes. Personnel changes? They identified the man that Newman killed on the grounds. He was one of Beck's automatons, put there as a contingency in case of Newman's escape. So, since the general's abominable failure, they have split the command between him and the unit commander of the covert search teams. The unit commander would make all the operational decisions.
It effectively castrates Beck. Not that he doesn't deserve it, he added angrily. But do we know anything about this unit, Commander? Talbot smiled. I will personally put his personnel file into your hands, my passion. The tall man hesitated, then leaned forward and kissed Talbot on the cheek. The streetwalker stood up, shook her head as she noticed the two old men, then walked out of the coffee shop. She hurried down the street to a phone box. Checking the Xerox copy of a small pencil sketch she pulled from her purse, she deposited the coins and dialed the number. She looked around to make sure she was alone. Ingrid here. I have found the one you are seeking. Some 30 miles away, in a converted barn on the outskirts of Munich, the evening debriefing session of the covert team was just wrapping up. Captain John Kilgore, the unit commander, was young, no more than 30. He wore blue jeans, a tight turtleneck that didn't hide the fact that he was in perfect condition, and, somewhat jarringly, combat boots. Next to him was Beck. Deep, black circles virtually surrounded his eyes. His skin was the color of old ground beef, and he had a tick under his left ear. His clothes looked slept in. Next to Beck was Dr. Kopp, appearing as indecipherable as usual, looking calmly out at the audience. Air, ground, immigration, none had had anything new to report. Okay, everybody, Kilgore was saying. It's been 33 days. 33 days, guys! He sounded legitimately angry. Granted, this guy makes his living avoiding guys like us, but come on! We make our living catching guys like him! Dismiss! They all quickly returned to work. Kopp and Beck followed Kilgore to his small private office. Kopp and Kilgore sat down, but Beck stayed standing. We're wasting time, he said, shaking his head. The younger officer looked over at him. Sir? We're not going to find him here. He started out of the room. Kilgore stared at the spot Beck had stood on. I'm starting to worry about him, he said. Kopp nodded solemnly. He's under more stress than I have ever observed in any individual. Most of it self-inflicted, in my opinion. Kilgore nodded, then turned to face the psychiatrist. Speaking of your opinions, you said you think Newman is still in the vicinity? Kopp nodded. You don't agree? No, because I wouldn't be. I've had a lot of the same training he's had. I know all the rules. Captain, Mr. Newman knows that you know them. He will assume that you, as a creature of the military, will do as you have done. Begin your search in the middle, slowly spiraling your way outward. He merely hides until you move on. Then he'll be free to go wherever he pleases. So what would you advise? Concentrate your efforts within the distance that Mr. Newman could have gotten by sunrise on foot the day he escaped. Kilgore appeared honestly torn between his orders and Kopp's advice. Command's convinced that he's already left the country, and they're worried about their budget. This is costing a ton of bucks. Kopp stood to leave. So, what will you do? Kilgore shrugged. I'll follow orders. But, he said as Kopp started to protest, I'll also increase local coverage by 25%. It's the best I can do, Doctor. It will not be enough, Captain. You're sure? Yes. How? Because I know him. Jack Clementi lay in a top-floor suite, racked with pain. He'd hardly been out of bed since the day of Newman's escape over a month ago. And Patricia was sick at heart. Immediately after the escape, there'd really been no time for post-mortems or second-guessing, just a flat-out dash to find and subdue the missing man. But after 2 weeks and no sign of Newman, the pace eased and regular duties began to intrude. That's when Talbot had called the meeting. Patricia had arrived at the chief's office, her resignation neatly typed up, expecting a short, ugly, depressing meeting. But when she was shown into Talbot's office, it seemed packed with people.
Jack Clementi, in a wheelchair and on oxygen, sat to the left of Tabbert. Otto Kopf and Pierre Mont lounged on the sofa, while General Beck sat by the window, silently staring out across the lawn. Dr. Tabbert sat behind his large, shiny desk. He nodded formally at Patricia as she entered and sat down. "I've been informed by the military," he began, "that they are done with us. Therefore, I believe it is time for us to formulate a report to the board of directors on what has happened and why. After long discussions with Dr. Clementi, I have reached the following preliminary conclusions. I would like all of your opinions on them." Patricia braced herself for the worst, but as Tabbert read down his list, Patricia began to understand. Then she smiled. It was to be a full-scale cover-up. Tabbert droned on with the official version of events that led to Newman's escape. The review board had shouldered full responsibility. The Institute was blameless and took full credit for keeping it from happening before. In return for her support of the cover-up, Patricia and Tabbert had reached an unspoken agreement. She would remain at the Institute, but Tabbert would see to it that she would never again receive important patients or assignments. But despite this victory of attrition, Patricia knew that she would always consider herself a failure until and unless she finally put the question of Brian Newman to rest. She felt an unquenchable desire to know where man was going, and Newman was the Rosetta Stone to unscrambling that puzzle. And he was gone. Ghislaine walked with increasing dread up the rickety stairs to the attic room reserved for the special patrons of his private club. The room had a dark history, and the occupants often had to pay a high price to have their messes cleaned up after they left. But the man who would soon come to the room was different from its usual patrons, who were wealthy, powerful men, controlling men with a need to be completely out of control, if only for a night. This man had no such need. He balanced on the thinnest edge between control and chaos, and never, ever toppled one way or the other. Just over 2 weeks earlier, it had begun. It had been almost noon. Ghislaine was asleep in his home outside Munich. The children were in school. His wife was downstairs puttering around. Suddenly he awoke, certain that something was very wrong. He sat bolt upright in bed. His wife, Frida, was standing by the foot of the bed, staring at him with wide-open eyes darting to her left. Ghislaine slowly turned. A man with a pleasant expression on his pale face stood there, pointing a sawed-off shotgun at Frida's head. Ghislaine remained stock still. "I have money," he said slowly. "In the safe. Take it all. We will not fight." "Thank you, but I'd much rather add to your safe than lighten it." He paused. "I have a business proposition for you." The man wanted a full set of identity papers of the highest quality. He wanted 3 men located, and he wanted a place where, as he put it, he could conduct his business with the men he was seeking. And he offered the most extraordinary thing in return. Ghislaine had made the deal instantly. He'd had no choice. He knew that the pleasant-faced man would easily kill him and his wife without a thought if he was refused. Since then, things had gone even better than the smiling man had promised. Each of the clubs in the playground that were real competition for Ghislaine had suffered major accidents, forcing them to close down. Most of their patrons had ended up at Ghislaine's. His business increased 5-fold. But now it was time for the devil to collect his due. Ghislaine stopped at the attic landing and unlocked the door to an expensive, sophisticated master's suite. A Victorian 4-poster bed was the centerpiece of plush carpets, mahogany furniture, and lush wallpaper. Designer lamps brightly lit the room, reflecting fine gilt mirrors. A full bath stood off to one side. Ghislaine pulled aside the heavy velvet curtains and unlocked the window and its barred grate overlooking the alley. Then he hurriedly shut the window, closed the heavy curtains, and quickly went downstairs to the street. Around the back of the building, in the alley, he finally stopped beneath the attic room. He checked his watch. It was 5 minutes to 1 in the morning. "Apollyon, it is Ghislaine. I have news." A moment later, the smiling man he knew as Apollyon slowly emerged from the shadows. The third man, Ghislaine handed over the pencil sketch of Talbot. A girl in the Reich district spotted him. Newman nodded and looked down at the sketch. Good. The dark, the alley, and the presence of this man combined to reinforce every fear the brothel owner had ever had. He spoke quickly. Once a week, your man arrives at the Poof Poof Cafe for a rendezvous with another man. They talk for about an hour, then leave separately. I have no information as yet on the other man except that he is supposed to be a dealer in Russian icons. I also have your papers. As requested, your name is Karan Apollyon, a naturalized Greek-American citizen from New York City. He paused. Such a unique name. Couldn't it cause unwanted attention? Just the opposite, Newman said. You want to get stopped? Use Joe Smith. Ghislaine shrugged. He reached into his jacket and handed across a sealed envelope. These are all the credit cards and papers you requested. Driver's license and social security passport. Ghislaine's cellular began to ring. He answered it quickly. Yeah? A long pause. Ein Moment? He turned to Newman. The first man, he has arrived. Shall I have him brought up? Newman looked around the alley. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Ghislaine quickly hurried away. Newman checked his watch. 1:03 a.m., 12 minutes to go. He melted back into the doorway to continue his wait and to think. He knew that he was being incredibly stupid for pursuing this private agenda, but he'd known that he had to do it from almost the first moments of his freedom. Hidden in the upper branches of the tree, he'd felt secure, largely ignoring the searchers. He'd mused over the various courses his life could take. In fact, when he had dropped from the tree, he still hadn't made up his mind which way to go. Beck's man changed that. The message was unquestionably clear. If Newman could not be contained, he must be killed. Beck wasn't really hurt. No broken bones, no obvious bruises. But there was a wound, and it cut completely through him. For almost 5 hours it had gone on. Relentless, implacable. Techniques guaranteed to obtain the desired results. Newman had learned well from his old Russian teachers. Beck told Newman the little that he knew. Why not? The man had a right to know, and he would find out eventually anyway. Already Beck was beginning to view Newman openly in the way that he'd always thought of him secretly, as a force of nature, capable of anything, anywhere, anytime. What Kopp had called the new man. He told Newman of Patricia's theory, as much as he understood of it anyway. He told him Clemente's theory. Hell, he'd even told him Mon's theory of anti-establishment neurosis. But he'd left out Kopp. Why? Even now he had no clear idea. But hang on to it, he did. Newman could have pressed harder, but he'd intentionally held back. It was as if even now, with all the barriers stripped away, he couldn't bring himself to really torture Beck. Too much had passed between them for that. But he could ask his questions, and he could demand his answers. He'd asked about the searchers. Who? How many? Where? When? But always he came back to the one central theme. Why? The answers would pour out ever slower, like thickening blood from a wound. Patricia, evolution. Clemente, disease. Mon, neurosis. And Beck's mind raced. Don't tell him Kopp. Never Kopp. Save something. Beat him at something. Anything. Then it was over. Newman helped him to the chair, carefully tended his rope-burned wrist and ankle. I'll have some ice sent up for that shoulder, he had said calmly. Maybe they have some liniment or something. He started for the door. If you leave this room in less than 3 hours, you'll be dead. After that, I don't care what you do. But whatever you do it under your own name, okay? The other is just too embarrassing. He left the room, chuckling to himself. Beck straightened in the chair.
Slowly he began unbuttoning his shirt. "I've lived one day too long," he muttered. On the other side of Munich, at Fürstenfeldbruck Air Station, a variation of the thought was being echoed. Too long, Ruanoff thought as he waited for his Aleutian Airbus to stop its rollout. He's been loose too long. The non-stop flight from St. Petersburg through stormy weather had left the former detention barracks commander moody and foul-tempered. Or perhaps it had been the dispatches that he'd received. 40 minutes later, Ruanoff recognized his contact in the reception lounge and fell into step alongside the tall man who had met with Tabbert. They climbed into a Volkswagen van at the curb, and the tall man pulled away. "Have there been any sightings?" Ruanoff asked. "No. There appears to be a dispute within the search team. The commander has asked for permission to redouble his efforts within 75 kilometers of the Institute on the advice of one of the doctors attached to his team. Higher command believes that the man has already left the country." Ruanoff thought it over. "What does our expert say?" The tall man smiled. "We will find out over breakfast, Colonel." He sensed Ruanoff's growing unease. "Don't worry, sir. If he's still here, we'll find him for you." 2 hours later, in the small coffee shop in the Reich district, Tabbert sat down at a booth across from the tall man and Ruanoff. "Madalena," the tall man said quietly, "I would like to introduce you to my partner from Moscow, Sergei Yov." He turned to Ruanoff. "Sergei, it is my most inestimable pleasure to introduce you to our hardest and most faithful worker, Madalena." "Doctor, it is indeed a profound honor to meet a man with the courage, intelligence, and fidelity of yourself." Tabbert beamed. "Please, Herr Yov, anything I can do to assist your noble company is my honor." Ruanoff nodded. The man was exactly as the tall man had said, self-involved, self-important, and obsequious. Ruanoff leaned forward. "I understand you can give us an update on the situation?" Tabbert nodded. "There have been 2 new developments. First, the search unit has been ordered to demonstrate some concrete results within 72 hours, but they are going to be returned to barracks. Forgive me, Doctor, but why, in your opinion, have they been unable to capture the man?" Tabbert seemed to think it over carefully. "The rigidity of their command structure is such that, in my expert opinion, they are unable to adapt to dealing with a psychopath who acts without reason or structure." Ruanoff decided that nothing would be gained by asking Tabbert for opinions. "Please go on," he said with a smile. "The second development is that it appears that the man with the titular charge of the search has gone missing." "General Beck?" "The very same. The general was scheduled to brief Washington this morning at 4 o'clock by secured circuits. When he failed to arrive in time, Captain Kilgore, the unit commander, ordered the general brought into headquarters, but they found his quarters unoccupied, his bed unslept in." "Indeed." Ruanoff was quiet for a long time. The tall man continued the debriefing, but Ruanoff knew the man had nothing more of value to offer. His mind wandered, as always, to Newman. Half an hour away from the coffee shop, safely secured in his grocery store, Newman spread out his early morning purchases: a container of coffee, a bag of sausages wrapped in pastry, and 30 marker pens in assorted colors. He uncovered the coffee, took a bite of the sausages, laid out the markers, and turned to the back wall. The work was hard, done mostly from memory, and several books that he'd bought especially for the occasion. By mid-morning it had become clear that it would take him most of the day, perhaps even into the night, but he couldn't stop until it was done. It was too important a part of his newly formed grand design. As soon as the gallery had been prepared, it would be time to deliver the invitations. Across town, breaking his long-standing tradition of never being seen in the playground in the morning, Ghislaine arrived at his club. Trying desperately to calm his heart, he headed up the stairs to the attic. He took a deep breath, tried the knob, and opened the door. He had seen many things on the days after he had left the attic room. Bodies, body parts, blood, dead animals. But something about this scene made him stop and mutter a silent prayer. Swinging at the end of a doubled-up curtain cord which hung from the hook that Apollyon had installed was the man that Apollyon had lured to this room last night. A stool lay nearby where it had clearly been kicked away by the suicide. The man was immaculately dressed, his hair combed and gelled. He had shaved recently, smelled like he had bathed, and his shoes appeared to have been freshly cleaned. And shoved under his watchband was a folded piece of paper. Ghislaine carefully pulled it free, reading the 3 words scrawled there: duty, honor, country. He shook his head and pocketed the paper. Ordinarily, his next steps would be routine, but Apollyon had carefully instructed Ghislaine on what he should do if he discovered the man's lifeless body when he arrived. Ghislaine was repulsed by the tasks, but he was not prepared to cross Apollyon. Not yet, anyway. 2 hours later, just after 1300, a U.S. government car pulled up outside the general's quarters, a small house owned by the Institute. Kilgore, the driver, got out, followed quickly by Kopp. They went up the path to the door. Kilgore knocked. There was no answer, so he pulled out a key and opened the door. "Hello? General Beck, sir? It's Kilgore. Hello?" He looked over at Kopp. Still gone. They walked into the living room. The house seemed orderly, clean, and completely empty. Kopp walked into the sleeping area. He stopped, staring at the king-sized bed in front of him. "Captain Kilgore?" Kilgore looked in. "Yes, Doctor." He froze. Lying on the bed, in full dress uniform with every hair in place and button polished, his hands folded across his chest, was General Alexander Beck. "Stay here," Kilgore said in an urgent whisper. Then he quickly drew his .45, moving silently and swiftly through the house. Kopp shook his head. "He's not here," he mumbled. With a deeply sad expression, he walked over to the bed, checked Beck's pulse to confirm the obvious, then slowly began a visual examination of the man. Kilgore returned 5 minutes later to find Kopp sitting on a nearby chair reading a piece of paper. "The place is empty and locked tight," Kilgore said as he put away his gun. "Can you tell what happened to him?" "He was hanged. Whether voluntarily or not, I cannot say." Kilgore shook his head. "What's that?" he asked, gesturing at the paper. "It was beneath his hands." Kopp continued reading, handing Kilgore an envelope addressed simply, "To all my friends on shore." "I will read it to you," Kopp said simply. "I commit to you the physical remains of Brigadier General Alexander Chamberlain Beck, Army of the United States. I rely on your humanity to see that he receives a proper military burial with honors. He fell in the line of duty. The specifics of his death are not important. I assume, of course, that I will be held responsible. I bear no significant animosity toward any of the individuals charged with my detention and, such as it was, treatment. I wish only to close out a bit of unfinished business, then move on. If you do not allow me this simple thing. Sincerely, Brian Newman." "I owe you an apology, Doctor," Kilgore said. "He is still around." Kopp stood up and walked to a window, staring out at the street as Kilgore picked up the phone. Adel, after a long, stressful night, slowly made his way to the front of the conference room to begin the debriefing of the night shift. Newman had betrayed him, made a mockery of his faith to escape, and now Beck was dead because of it. While he waited for the men to settle down, he began to flip through the file his secretary had put on the podium. Shift reports, requests for equipment upgrades, space heaters, and hot food, and a sealed envelope labeled merely Conrad. He held the envelope up to his secretary. "What's this?" She shrugged. "It was on your desk when I came in this morning." Adel thumbed it open, pulled out the paper, and began to read. After a moment, his hand shaking, he put the paper back in the envelope. "There'll be a 10-minute delay in the debriefing. he said to a sea of shocked faces. He hurried out of the room and went to find Dr. Kopp. "He was here," Adel whispered. He held out the note to Kopp, who slowly read it. "Dear Conrad," it said, "forgive me for not writing sooner. I am well and hope you are the same. You probably won't believe me, but my actions were in no way directed at you. I did what I felt I had to do to protect myself and my future. I believe when you are over the shock and feelings of disloyalty, you will agree. I miss our talks, our discussion of scriptures, our sharing of past misadventures. I miss your wise counsel. Need it more than ever now. If you can find it in your heart to grant forgiveness to this perpetual sinner, I would like very much to meet with you one last time before I begin what will undoubtedly be a long journey of personal exile. If you agree, be at your office phone this afternoon at 5:30. I will call with the arrangements. If you cannot forgive me, know that I understand and still deeply appreciate all you tried to do to quiet the rage in my soul. I remain your brother-in-arms, Brian Newman, C.A. Kopp looked down at the note again. "The C.A., do you know what it means?" Adel shook his head as he hurried back to the conference room. "Probably nothing," he said. "That," Kopp said to himself, "I do not believe." They were all there. Kilgore, Kopp, Patricia, even Tappert. The plans had been laid, equipment portioned out, personnel positioned. Adel sat at his desk, waiting for the phone to ring. 5:20. 5:25. 5:30. Nothing. 5:31. 5:32. 5:33. Long minutes, seeming like hours. Then, a knock on the door, causing everyone to jump. "What is it?" Adel almost yelled. The shocked orderly who opened the door took a step back. "There's this guy on the payphone in the lobby saying he's got to talk to you." They all raced out the door. Adel spotted the payphone with the receiver lying on top of it. "Conrad Adel?" "Did you think to tap the payphones, Conrad?" Newman's voice sounded amused. "No." Kilgore took down the payphone number, then raced to another phone. "Well, that's going to make your life a little more complicated, isn't it?" "I'm getting used to it. I received your letter." "And?" Newman sounded expectant. "I would like to talk about it." "Unfortunately, I don't have the time right now. Give me your answer. I'm hanging up in 10 seconds. Adel looked quickly around the group. Seeing no other options, he turned back to the phone. "I agreed to meet with you." "I thought you might. The phone box at the northeast corner of Jaliksburg and Klimstrasse in 30 minutes. The line went dead. So it went throughout the night. Adel drove from phone box to phone box, each time being given terse instruction to the next call and a set time to get there. 5 hours later, he was in a restaurant, having just received his instructions from a phone box outside. The maitre d', beaming as the result of a 150-mark tip received earlier that evening, led Adel to a curtained booth in the back. Adel took a deep breath, tried to calm his racing heart, then stepped through the curtain. The table was set with an assortment of foods. A strange man sat at its head, quietly staring at him. "Who are you?" Adel demanded. "I represent the man you seek." "Where is he?" Adel asked in a steely tone. "Sir," Ghislaine said in a tense voice, "we are neither of us going anywhere for the moment. Not if we wish to avoid catastrophe. Please sit down. Have something to eat. It has all been paid for. If you leave before your instructions, your meeting will never take place." Slowly, reluctantly, Adel sat down. He sat there silently, picked at a salad, sipped from a beer. Finally, he heard the buzz of a cellular phone. "Yes?" Ghislaine paused, then handed it across to Adel. "Hello?" "Enjoy the meal?" Adel remained silent. "Okay, leave through the back of the restaurant. Turn right. That'll take you to Brennstrasse. Turn left and you'll be contacted at the first phone box." The line went dead. As Adel approached the phone box, it began to ring. "Yes?" It was Ghislaine. "Turn around, please." Then he hung up. Confused, Adel slowly turned around. "Hello, Conrad," Newman said as he stepped out of a nearby doorway. "Care to take a walk?" He gestured down the street to Adel's right. 10 feet in front of me, if you please." They started off. "Were all these theatrics really necessary?" Adel asked, without looking back. "Please hold all questions to the end of the tour," was the amused response. At Newman's direction, they turned down alleys, crossed dark streets, doubled back on themselves several times, until the smells of Turkish coffee, hashish, and marijuana mixed in the still night air. These, combined with the boarded-up buildings, told Adel exactly where they were. Finally, they stopped in front of a small grocery. Newman unlocked the door, locking it again as soon as they were inside. For a few minutes he stared through a tiny tear in the newspapers covering the windows before he put on the lights. Adel looked around the deserted store, noticing that the back wall was covered with a sheet. Newman gestured at a pair of folding chairs, and they both sat down. Newman seemed distracted. He picked up a marker cap from the floor and started playing with it as he talked. "I've been thinking about our talks. They were very important to me, had a great deal of influence on my thoughts this last month or so." Adel sneaked a glance at his watch. 5 more minutes, he thought. Delay, agree, pause, wait. Adel looked around, noticing a Bible on a nearby table. "You have continued to study?" Newman got up and handed him the Bible. Adel opened it to the marked pages and read the underlined passage. Newman recited it from memory. "I did not sit in the company of merrymakers, nor did I rejoice. I sat alone because thy hand was upon me, for thou hadst filled me with indignation." Adel looked up to see a pained expression in his eyes, his fists clenching and unclenching. "Why is my pain unceasing? My wound incurable, refusing to be healed? Wilt thou be to me like a deceitful brook, like waters that fail?" "You blame God for your troubles?" Adel spoke, his voice soft, caring, pastoral. Forgotten for that one moment who the man in front of him was, what he had done, as well as what he could do, and that there were less than 3 minutes left. "God is your salvation, not your tormentor." "But I never said I blamed God," Newman said coldly. "No?" Newman shook his head. "No. On the contrary, I thank him for those gifts." Adel looked completely confused. I don't understand what gifts." "My isolation, indignation, my pain, my wounds, even my eternal abandonment have been blessings, not curses." "What are you saying?" Newman smiled, walked over to the sheet on the wall, then ripped it down. Adel turned, looked, then froze. There was 1 minute left. Outside the grocery, the search team was almost fully deployed, having followed the miniature tracking beacon that Adel had swallowed before leaving the Institute. He had been fully in agreement with the plan of attack. They would wait 10 minutes after he finally met with their target. Then they would come in hard and fast. As a former counterterrorist himself, Adel understood the necessities of what would be an overwhelming assault. Kilgore checked his watch. It was time. Patricia, Kopp, and Tabbert stood by his command van. Their fears were written on their faces. Seconds later, 8 or 9 booming roars echoed through the street as blinding flashes of orange and blue light leapt up inside the store. Smoke poured through the shattered windows and combined with falling glass from nearby buildings. The heavily armed and gas-masked search teams poured into the tiny store like ants on an animal carcass. 10 minutes later, a soot-stained Kilgore walked slowly back to the psychiatrists, who had moved in front of the blasted store. "Nothing. Place is empty. They were there, but there's a freaking big hole near the back of the place. The son of a bitch dug right through the freaking foundation into an old sewer line. Looks like it dates from the war. I got men down there now, but it's a damn maze." Kilgore took a slug of oxygen, then wiped his eyes, watery from the tear gas, with a damp handkerchief. "There's one more thing, guys. There's something in there you need to see." 1 kilometer away, deep in Wittelsbach Park, a sewer grate creaked and moaned under the constant pressure of 4 hands. Finally it gave way with a noisy crack. A pair of eyes cautiously appeared through the open grate, then Adel, followed quickly by Newman, climbed out. "Hey," Newman was saying as he straightened, "you didn't have to come." Adel was bleeding slightly from the nose. "I wasn't given any choice." The young former commando smiled at the old former commando. "All I did was throw you in. If I hadn't, you'd be looking at a state funeral about now." He looked around. "Time to go." He took a few steps, then turned back to the security chief. "Don't follow me, okay? I don't want to save your life, then end it in the same hour." Adel looked at his comrade. "Don't run. Let me bring you in." Adel walked over to him. "Listen to me, Brian." A shot rang out. Newman threw himself to the ground and rolled to his side. In almost the same movement, he pulled the Tokarev TT-33 pistol that he'd had Ghislaine get for him. Quickly, he fired 4 rounds at the spot he'd seen the muzzle flash. When no fire was returned, he fired 4 more rounds into the dark. He quickly dropped the clip and threw in another. As he did, a figure jumped up from behind a rock and raced off. Newman fired 5 rounds at the running form, then slowly stood up. "I know him," he said softly. Then he turned back to Adel. "How the hell did you figure out where to—" He stopped. Adel was crouched on all 4s near the spot he'd been standing. His head was down and he was breathing heavily. Newman walked over to him and knelt down. "Where?" he asked softly. "A not good place," Adel wheezed out. Newman took a deep breath. "Shit." They had brought in large fans to ventilate the small storefront. Evidence-gathering specialists were carefully picking through the wreckage. Technicians were setting up sodium vapor lights in the back where the lights had been knocked out. Kilgore led the doctors through the shattered scene. "It's here on the back wall." The psychiatrists peered through the semi-gloom, trying to make it out. Seconds later, the sodium vapor light sizzled to life, then threw the entire area into a painfully bright resolution. "Remarkable," Patricia said excitedly. "Extraordinary," Talbot said in a hushed voice. Kopp moved back a few feet to take in the entire mural at once. He stood there, not saying a word, an unnoticed tear slowly working its way down his grim face. The mural was set in a green field. A light purple sky with orange clouds serenely looked down on the field, which was dotted with hills covered in green bushes. In the middle of this pastoral scene were 6 people, running naked toward the hills, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies bleeding from angry welts. And they bore an eerie resemblance to Alexander Beck, Manfred Tabbert, Jack Clemente, Otto Kopp, Conrad Adel, and Patricia Nelwyn. They seemed to be running through piles of tortured, dismembered bodies. In pursuit, flying midway between the ground and the sky, was a swarm of things. They were insect-like, with translucent wings. Their bodies seemed to be covered by contoured steel plates bolted in place. They had jointed, upwardly curving tails with sharp red stingers. Blood dripped from some. A human arm hung off another. A still-beating heart was impaled on yet another. The insect things' heads had long, blonde hair topped by golden crowns. Their faces were all Brian Newman. His eyes were yellow-orange, his teeth exaggerated in length and sharpness, his expression purely feral, but it was Newman. Off in the farthest corner of the mural was the mouth of a volcano, from which the insect things appeared to be swarming. Next to it stood a silhouette of a man. Behind him, gaps in the smoke from the volcano appeared to form a series of numbers over his head. 2, 27, 9, 1, 11. Kopp, biting his lower lip, seemed to be deeply conflicted. Leaving the others, he wandered through the debris. Finally, he stopped, kneeled down, then dusted off a book he pulled from under a chunk of wall. He sat down and began flipping through it. "The resentment directed at who he perceives as his tormentors," Tabbert was saying. "I understand. But what I find interesting is his subconscious manifestation of himself as a form of insect life. Perhaps a latent inferiority complex." Patricia shook her head. "More like a metamorphosis." Kopp's voice cut through, causing them both to turn to him. "And the 5th angel blew his trumpet," he read in a strong voice. And I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key of the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green growth of any tree, but only those of mankind who have not the seal of God upon their foreheads. He stood up and walked over to the mural. "It begins to become clear," he said softly. "This strange inscription on the envelope, the statements that others need adjust to him rather than the opposite, the initials after his signature, this drawing." He continued reading aloud. "In appearance the locusts were like horses arrayed for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had scales like iron breastplates. They have tails like scorpions and stings." He closed the book, finishing from memory. "They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollyon." Talbot was trembling as he looked from Kopp to the mural, but Patricia just looked confused. Kopp laughed cynically. "Brian Newman has gone quite insane." Kilgore, who had been on a cellular for the last few minutes, came up and joined the conversation. "We've got the man who met with Adel. He's given us Newman's alias." "What's the last name?" Kopp asked. "Abaddon or Apollyon?" Kilgore was stunned. "Apollyon," he said quietly. "So he's now Charon Apollyon." Kopp seemed to be in deep contemplation. "How in hell did you know that?" As Kopp answered the soldier, he kept his gaze locked on Patricia. "I was raised in a more rigid world than this. My upbringing consisted of school and church, and as with most of my countrymen, the chief of staff included," he said as he glanced at the trembling Talbot. "The tale depicted in Mr. Newman's frightening representation is well known to me. It was used on a great many occasions, I'm afraid, to put the fear of God into me, as you Americans say. The numbers are from the archaic Lutheran steganograph." He handed the Bible to Kilgore. 2 indicates the second, or New Testament, 27 the book of Revelation, 9 the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 11. "What's the first name he's using?" Kilgore asked. "To all my friends on shore," Kopp smiled. "The inscription on the envelope. Charon is the Greek figure of mythology who ferried the souls of the damned across the river Styx. You confirmed that he had chosen the Greek form of the angel of the bottomless pit. Remember that he signed his note to Chief Adel with the letter C.A. after his name? Charon Apollyon. All perfectly clear." "Not to me," Patricia said angrily. "Not at all." She took several angry steps away before whirling back to face Kopp. "And who says that he's gone insane?" "Newman," was his sad-voiced answer. Adel groaned as a spasm of pain shook his body. "It is, I think, over with me." He smiled weakly. "After all these years." He coughed up some blood, and Newman quickly wiped the dying man's face. "To be shot down by my own, it is supreme irony." Newman looked down at him. "But it wasn't one of ours." "No?" "It was a Russian." His eyes went cold, violence pouring off of him like an odor. "A Russian colonel named Ruinov." That seemed in some odd way to please Adel. "There's symmetry in that," the former Cold Warrior said softly. He looked up into Newman's eyes. "You will kill this Russian?" "Without a doubt." Adel nodded, causing another paroxysm of pain to roll through his body. "It is not Christian of me, but somehow that makes me feel clean. Do you understand?" "I do." Newman brushed the man's hair out of his eyes. "Is there anything I can do for you? Any arrangements you want made?" His voice was soft, but not comforting. "I am alone, except for my church." He paused. "But I would like to be buried in the churchyard. By the juniper, I think." Newman nodded. "I'll make sure they know," he said. "And if they don't, I'll move you there myself. You have my word." Adel smiled as he coughed up more blood. There's just one more thing.
Name it.
They have all said a great many things about you. The talkers, the doubters, the doctors, and I seen your picture. I would like to know, please.
Newman bent down and whispered in the dying man's ear. Slowly, a smile spread over the man's face. Newman straightened up.
Ah,
Adel said.
That is as it should be.
Then he looked up at Newman with a deep longing in his eyes.
I do not believe in allowing men to suffer needlessly. Do you?
Newman shook his head, came to attention, then snapped a salute. Adel straightened himself, closed his eyes, then began reciting.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom comes, thy will be done.
Newman's right hand flashed out, smashing Adel across the bridge of his nose, sending bone fragments flying into his brain. He quivered for a moment, then lay quiet.
On earth as it is in heaven,
Newman finished, as he turned and walked off into the night. She had been going for over 30 hours without a break. Her temples were throbbing from sleep deprivation, hunger, confusion, and anger. Patricia dumped her purse on her bed as she stripped off her clothes. She threw on her robe and walked to the bathroom. As she went through the door, a powerful hand reached out, grabbing her by the throat, brutally shoving against the bathroom wall. She could barely breathe, barely think, as Newman put his face inches from hers. His eyes were wide open and unblinking. Nostrils flared, taking deep, even breaths. His expression was beyond fury.
I have a message for you and your associates, Newman whispered. I'm making you responsible for delivering it. Nod for yes, die for no.
She felt his breath on her face as she nodded.
Conrad Adel is dead, by my hand, but not by my wish. He is to be buried in the yard of his church by the juniper. I'm making you responsible for it. Nod for yes, die for no.
She nodded quickly.
I'm leaving soon. Any attempt to stop me will cause disaster. There are reactors in places other than Abkhaz. I'm making you responsible for it. Nod for yes, die for no.
Again, a quick, terrified nod. He dragged her back into the bedroom and threw her onto the bed. 2 minutes later, she was tied securely.
After I've left the country and you all start to forget what really happened.
He put his mouth against her ear.
Don't come after me. Ever.
He whispered.
I'm making you responsible.
He gagged her, then walked over to the telephone and calmly dialed a number.
Hi,
he said in an upbeat tone.
Can I speak with John Kilgore, room 1296? Thanks loads.
He turned to Patricia, loosening the ropes on her ankles as he waited. He suddenly turned back to the phone.
Captain Kilgore! Yeah. Karan Apollyon. Why don't we get together? I'm at Patricia Nelwyn's.
He paused.
You have 40 minutes, he said as he hung up.
He smiled at Patricia, who looked terrified.
Relax, Doc. Someone's got to untie you.
Talbot was on his way home from the Institute. For the first time in days, Brian Newman was not on his mind. That, to Talbot, made the long, trying day a very good day after all. It had been 3 weeks since the debacle at the grocery, since the embarrassing raid at Dr. Nelwyn's house, since the discovery of Conrad Adel's body. Other than the name Karan Apollyon, the brothel owner had yielded nothing of importance. Everything in the grocery had been dissected and interpreted. Specialists had removed the mural to the Institute for further study, but no trace of Newman could be found. They'd taken every possible precaution to avoid Newman's threat. Patricia had supervised the funeral for Adel in his churchyard near the juniper, and the search team had made a great show of breaking down the headquarters in the barn and pulling out of the Institute. Nevertheless, in a highly secured hangar at Reinsgarth Air Base, they continued the search. Newman had become the #1 priority of all arms of American intelligence, wanted, dead or alive. As he came to the one-lane bridge near his home, Talbot stopped. A car was in front of him, so he waited as the law demanded for it to cross first, but instead it just sat. He honked his horn, still no movement. He turned at a knocking on his driver's side window. "Was ist los?" Talbot asked as he lowered the window. A rag soaked in chlorpromazine covered his face, instantly rendering him unconscious. 35 minutes later, he slowly came to. Talbot's vision was still cloudy, his head throbbing, and he was sick to his stomach.
What is going on? He demanded in German. He heard steps come toward him, then flinched as a cool, damp rag was held over his face. Blink it into your eyes, it'll help. Tabbert did as he was told, then slowly opened his eyes when it was removed. My God, what? How? Tabbert began to stutter. I have some questions for you, Newman said flatly. Tabbert began to pull himself together as the initial shock wore off. I will tell you nothing. Now release me at once. Who's the tall Russian you meet with at the Hofkeller in the Reich district? The fear deepened, as did Tabbert's resolve not to say anything. He firmly clenched his jaw. Newman pulled his chair closer to the bound man. Now, Manfred, he said in a friendly voice, we both know that you're going to tell me everything I want to know. Why not make it easy on yourself? He slowly pulled a large hunting knife from a scabbard in his boot. The Hofkeller in the Reich district, a tall Russian man who deals in icons and antiques, remember? Tabbert couldn't take his eyes off the knife blade. Please, I know nothing. Newman shook his head. You know anatomy. None of the cuts will be lethal. You're a doctor. You know how many things I can slice up or cut off without causing death. No! Tabbert screamed. The Hofkeller in the Reich district, a tall Russian man who deals in icons and antiques, remember? In his hotel suite, Ruinoff was holding a consultation with the tall man. We've had no word on Captain Kilgore since the foolishness at the grocery, Ruinoff was saying. What do we know of his intentions? I've been trying to reach Madalena with no success as yet. There was a knock at the door. Ruinoff looked at him. The fool isn't stupid enough to contact us here, is he? The tall man walked to the door. Who? He asked. Madalena, came the high-pitched reply. The tall man angrily shook his head. He apparently is that stupid. He unlocked and opened the door. Ruinoff heard a muffled popping sound, turning in time to see the tall man crumple to the floor as the door closed. Colonel? Newman aimed the Tokarev at Ruinoff's eye level as he slowly walked deeper into the room. Ruinoff didn't move, just stared at the man behind the gun and thought of all the things he would never do. I will give you a choice. You can die painlessly or not. What do you want? How did you find me? I knew you would not leave yourself without a way out. He gestured at the tall man who lay dead on the floor. He knew of the old fascist tunnel system. I ordered men to all the most isolated exits. That I was at the one you emerged from was sheer luck. Bad luck. So it would appear. Why'd you kill Conrad Adel? The security man. An unfortunate accident. I was aiming at you. All right. He pulled the trigger once. Ruinoff was dead before he hit the floor. Painlessly. 10 minutes after midnight, Kopp carried several cardboard boxes into his office. He began to sort through his files, putting some in a box, others in drawers. A few minutes into the job, he looked up as Patricia walked in. Can I help you, Dr. Nevin? Jack Clementi's dead. Kopp nodded silently. It seems he just stopped breathing when no one was around. Kopp steadied himself on his desk. There is a merciful force in the universe. She looked at the boxes. What's going on? I'm leaving this place. Why? There's nothing here for me anymore. I am old. It may well be time for the next generation. But you can help us find Newman. You know Captain Kilgore has orders to assassinate Newman when he is found. I know. Help me fight them. No. Why not? He seemed to be studying something on the lawn beneath his window. He suddenly turned and started out of the office. Because I agree with them. He rushed downstairs, leaving the main building through a back door. Ignoring the cold and falling snow, he walked across the lawn toward Unit A249, stopping under the tree where Beck's man had been killed. It is dangerous for you to be here, he said quietly. The world is a dangerous place. I missed you. I just wanted to say goodbye. We won't see each other again. I know. Newman noticed the old man was shivering. He took off his jacket and put it around Kopp's shoulders. You should take better care of yourself. You ain't as young as springtime anymore. Where will you go? That's to find out. What will you do? Don't you know? Consider. Speculate. Study. Kopf nodded. In search of yourself. No. In search of others like me. Like you. Me? Lie to others if you like, but not to me, brother. Kopf nodded slowly. You know. How? I just did. Kopf turned his back on Newman. Very well. I told them you were insane. And you understood my portrait. Kopf nodded. Newman turned the old man around. I won't spend the rest of my life on display for charlatans and mountebanks like the good Dr. Nelwyn, and I won't spend the rest of my life in hiding. I had to make sure that they wouldn't take me alive. Kilgore has his orders to shoot on sight. Of course. Brian Newman has gone round the bend, convinced himself he's some avenging angel from hell's depths out to destroy mankind. The DOD just can't allow that kind of behavior from one of its assets. I looked into that portrait, then looked into myself, and I knew. The only way they would ever stop looking is if they killed you themselves. It is what I would have done. Kopf looked at Newman with a deep pain coming from somewhere inside of his very being. What are we? Don't you know? For the majority of my 78 years I have asked that question. I have fought the hatred, the frustration. I've lived the life of an ascetic, being always vigilant to never allow a vagrant moment when what is within me might become loosed. But I have found no answers. What was it Nelwyn said? That we were the next evolutionary age of man? I think you called it Homo crudalis. Kopf nodded sadly. Very poetic of you. We're not the next step. Not even close to it. Maybe a half step, maybe even less than that, but I'm fairly certain that we're still Homo sapiens. A friend asked me what I was not too very long ago. What did you say? Homo sapiens saevus. The savage, wise man. A half step indeed. Newman noticed that people in groups of 2 or 3 seemed to be randomly walking on the lawn, moving toward them, slowly encircling them. The question is, he said as he slowly began to stretch his legs and upper arms, a half step in what direction? As man evolves, he's slowly losing his little toe and little finger. If he de-evolves, they'll grow longer. I guess that's how we'll know which way we're going. Kopf looked at him, a tear trickling down his cheek. And which do you think it is? He asked. I'll let you know, brother, Newman said. Farewell. He sprinted off to his left. Instantly, floodlights came on, illuminating every inch of the back lawn. Shouts were raised back and forth as the American search team spread out, not firing but steadily closing the circle around their quarry. Newman zigzagged across the lawn at top speed, low to the ground, head down. His mind was clear, precise, functioning, analyzing, seeing everything and playing out each possible permutation. 100 meters, he thought, 90. The first shot slashed out at him from behind. He instantly dropped to his knees, rolled, came up running again. 50 meters, 30 meters more. Another burst caught him in the right calf, knocking him over. He paused. They'll stop, he thought. Stop, look to see, pause. The firing stopped. He jumped to his feet and with a final burst of speed threw himself through the heating plant's open doorway. Newman could hear Kilgore's voice. Second squad around the back. Nobody fire, you hear me? Nobody fire. We've got natural gas lines and stored petrol in there. Newman forced himself to his feet, ignoring his bleeding leg. Calm, collected, exactly where he wanted to be. He pulled himself toward the center of the plant, the great pipe that carried the superheated air from the natural gas furnaces below him to the main building. Found the box that he'd left by the pipe hours before, opened the lid, and began to throw switches. Brian Newman! Kilgore called through a bullhorn. Brian Newman! Come out with your hands! Kilgore was cut off by two small roars, followed by a low rumble. Then, as if the earth itself was vomiting forth, a fireball broke loose from the small building. The explosion knocked out all the glass in the Institute's main building. The concussion knocked most of the commandos instantly unconscious. Up it rose, an expanding sphere of fire and fury into the midnight sky, spreading its smoke and toxic fumes across most of northern Munich. Newman's portrait come alive. 12 were dead, 65 injured, 4 missing. A crater 30 feet in diameter remained the only marker of where the heating plant had once stood. The Institute lay empty, a battered, abandoned monument. Tabbert wandered the corridors. The people of Munich had been told that an unexploded bomb from the war had gone off near an underground gas line. NATO was praised for responding so quickly to this peacetime emergency. Kilgore himself had sustained a crushed right leg and a dislocated shoulder, but he was on the scene nevertheless, supervising the last act of his search for Brian Newman. For 3 days, a special team of NATO forensic experts had been probing through the crater. Why? Was about all Patricia had been able to say in the last 3 days. Kopf couldn't remember the last time he slept. After being knocked to the ground in the explosion, he had hurried to the scene, helping where he could until the emergency services could arrive. He'd saved many lives, but still felt drained and empty, as if something newly given to him had been snatched away in that moment of frenzy and destruction. He'd made himself wallow in that emptiness because to contemplate the alternative was too dangerous to consider. On the 4th morning, Patricia and Kopf stood by the crater watching. Then she tapped him on the shoulder and pointed at some activity in the forensics tent. They slowly walked over. She noticed Kilgore nodding grimly as he made notes on a clipboard. "Captain, what's going on?" "It's over. They found Newman. Or what's left of him, anyway. We got prints, blood typing, and preliminary DNA results." Kopf moved in behind the figures who were bent over the examining table. "Man," one of them joked, "that must have hurt." "Ouch," another said. The lead pathologist gently lifted the torn-out little finger with a pair of forceps. Lying next to it was a torn-out little toe. Kopf turned and slowly walked away. He got into the back of one of the olive-green staff cars. 25 Rambertstrasse? The driver nodded and pulled out. For the first time since that night, Kopf realized that he was still wearing Newman's jacket. Without knowing why, he looked in the pockets. All he found was a card envelope. "Mon frère," it said. He opened it and read the single sheet of paper contained within. He recognized it as part of a poem by an American poet, but he couldn't remember which one. "Thy soul shall find itself alone, mid dark thoughts of the grey tombstone, not one of all the crowd to pry into thine hour of secrecy. Be silent in that solitude which is not loneliness, for then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee, and their will shall overshadow thee. Be still." Kopf smiled, folded the note, put it back in his pocket, and easily fell asleep in the back of the car.